The story you're about to hear is not only about war, it is about what happens when a nation forgets its conscience. In the quiet towns of Europe, before the bombs and the battlefields, there were neighbors who shared bread, laughter, and faith. Within a single generation, that trust would vanish, replaced by fear, by whispers, by trains that never came back. It began not with gas chambers, but with words, with the slow drip of lies that turned hatred into habit. Tonight, we journey through that descent, from speeches to smoke, from laws to ashes. The plan the Nazis called the final solution was not born in secrecy, but in daylight, drafted by educated men who wore suits, spoke politely, and signed papers that condemned millions. They believed they were building a perfect world. Instead, they built a wound that history still cannot heal. For those who lived, memory became a second life, a promise to speak for those who could not. For those who perished, their silence remains the world's unanswered question. How could ordinary people let it happen? Close your eyes now. The world of the 1,930 seconds drifts back into focus. The echo of boots on cobblestones, the glow of torches reflected in broken glass. This is not just a story of Germany, but of humanity itself, of what we are capable of, and what we must never become again. You are listening to Lullaby of Empires, and this is the final solution, the darkest Nazi plan, seeds of hatred. The guns of the First World War had fallen silent, but the silence did not bring peace. Across Europe, millions of men limped home to towns in ruins, to families broken by grief, to nations that no longer believed in themselves. In Germany, that silence was heavier than anywhere else, a silence filled with bitterness, humiliation, and hunger. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles carved punishment into paper. The once proud German Empire was stripped of land, colonies, and pride. Reparations drained its treasury. The Allied blockade starved its people. In the streets of Berlin, veterans begged beside widows. Children carried buckets of thin soup home to apartments lit by candles because coal was too expensive to burn. And in that gloom, whispers began soft at first, then louder, seeking someone to blame. The whispers turned toward the Jews. They had lived in Germany for centuries, doctors, teachers, shopkeepers, soldiers who had fought in the Kaiser's army. Yet conspiracy mongers claimed they had profited from the war, betrayed the army, poisoned the nation. The stab-in-the-back myth that Germany had been defeated not by foreign enemies, but by traitors within spread like infection. It was a comforting lie for a wounded nation, and in every lie, someone must be chosen to bear the guilt. By 1920, the air of Munich buzzed with meetings and manifestos. In beer halls thick with smoke, demagogues shouted about renewal, purity, and vengeance. Among them stood a failed Austrian artist named Adolf Hitler, a man with fire in his voice and hatred in his heart. He had discovered that words could wound deeper than bullets. When he spoke of national rebirth, crowds leaned forward, eyes shining. When he blamed the Jews for Germany's humiliation, they roared their approval. Out of applause, a movement was born. The National Socialist German Workers' Party promised salvation through unity and obedience. Its message was simple enough for a starving man to understand. We have been betrayed. We must cleanse ourselves. In those years of hyperinflation, when savings vanished overnight and people carried wages home in wheelbarrows, the promise of order sounded like music. Hitler offered certainty, and certainty is seductive to the desperate. The poison spread through posters, pamphlets, and rumor. Old prejudices dressed themselves in new clothes: race, science, statistics, charts that claimed to measure human worth. Professors lectured that Jews were parasites. Newspapers printed caricatures. Schoolbooks described Aryan children with golden hair and perfect skulls. Pseudoscience gave hatred the dignity of data. Each lie wore the mask of reason. Meanwhile, democracy, fragile, weary, tried to stand. The Weimar Republic held elections. drafted a constitution, and prayed that rational minds would prevail. But every crisis weakened it. Assassinations, coups, the Great Depression that emptied factories and filled unemployment lines. By the early 1932s, German faith in democracy had collapsed as completely as its currency once had. Many longed not for freedom, but for a strong hand to guide them. They would soon find that hand. In 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. He did not seize power overnight. He was invited in. Within months, the invitation became surrender. The Reichstag burned. Civil rights dissolved. Opposition parties banned. Camps sprouted on the edges of cities, first for political enemies, then for anyone deemed undesirable. Behind barbed wire, the regime rehearsed its future. Still, in those early years, the Jews of Germany clung to normal life. Many believed this madness would pass. They had seen persecution before. They had also seen it fade. Synagogues remained open. Schools taught children to hope. But slowly, invisibly, the circle tightened. Jewish civil servants were dismissed. Professors expelled. Shops boycotted. Signs appeared in windows. Juden verboten, Jews forbidden. Neighbors looked away. It was easier not to see. Propaganda filled the empty spaces of daily life. The radio, the cinema, the classroom. Joseph Goebbels, the master of Nazi persuasion, understood that repetition creates belief. Every speech, every film, every poster sang the same refrain: purity, destiny, betrayal, renewal. Hatred became a lullaby whispered to a nation until it no longer sounded like hate at all. To many Germans, life seemed to improve. Jobs returned, roads were built, parades marched again through Berlin. Pride was restored, banners fluttering red and black. But the cost of that pride was hidden in plain sight, in the silence of neighbors arrested at night, in the laughter of children trained to salute. Evil seldom arrives wearing horns. It enters draped in promises. Across Europe, the world watched, some in fear, others in admiration. Statesmen called Hitler a bulwark against communism, a restorer of order. Newspapers wrote cautiously, hoping diplomacy could tame him. Few recognized that his vision required an enemy, and that the enemy had already been chosen. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws stripped German Jews of citizenship, forbade marriage between Jews and Aryans, and defined humanity by bloodlines. Bureaucrats drafted definitions of race, as though drafting building codes. Suddenly, identity was a legal crime. Teachers removed Jewish children from classrooms. Doctors lost licenses. Soldiers were erased from honor rolls. The state had transformed prejudice into policy. A slow, bureaucratic machinery began turning paper by paper, law by law, toward something unimaginable. Outside Germany, refugees fled wherever doors remained open. But doors were closing. The world was still climbing out of depression. Nations argued quotas, not mercy. Ships arrived in harbors only to be turned away. Families scattered across continents, seeking safety that rarely came. Those who stayed behind still hoped reason would return. It never did. By 1938, Hitler's Reich stretched beyond its borders, Austria absorbed in a thunder of flags and cheers. That March, Austrian Jews were forced to scrub streets with toothbrushes while crowds jeered. Within months came Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Synagogues burned, while firefighters protected nearby German homes. Windows shattered, businesses looted, thousands arrested. The smell of smoke drifted through cities once civilized. It was no longer possible to pretend this was merely politics. It was persecution laid bare. For older Germans who remembered Jewish friends from school or comrades from the trenches, it was bewildering, and yet many remained silent. Silence is the partner of cruelty. It gives evil space to grow. And so the silence deepened. By the time the world reacted, it was too late. The seeds had already been sown in speeches, in textbooks, in the unspoken understanding that one group's suffering was another's renewal. Those seeds would soon bloom into ghettos, deportations, and smoke. But here, in the 1,930 seconds before the world caught fire, they still looked like patriotism. Evenings in Berlin were filled with music again, theaters reopened, radios hummed with symphonies conducted by men loyal to the Reich. People danced, unaware that history was already closing its hands around them. For Jews, each passing year narrowed the horizon. Friendships dissolved, passports were stamped with red letters, and fear became routine. Mothers tucked children into bed, whispering that tomorrow might be better. Fathers searched for visas that never came. Those who left often faced heartbreak abroad, stateless, penniless, labeled as undesirable aliens. Yet even exile was mercy compared to what awaited those who stayed. The machinery of hatred was running now, smooth and confident, feeding on applause and indifference. And at its center stood a man convinced that destiny had chosen him to purify the world. In 1939, on the eve of war, Hitler told his generals that the coming conflict would bring annihilation to the Jews of Europe. Most in the room did not yet grasp what that meant, but the blueprint was already drawn in his mind, a continent cleansed of those he deemed unworthy of life. The years ahead would turn rhetoric into reality, prejudice into policy, and human beings into ash. The tragedy of the Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers. It began with words spoken, printed, repeated until belief became reflex. It began with silence, the silence of those who looked away, convinced it was not their concern. And it began with ordinary people, clerks, teachers, policemen, who followed orders because obedience felt safer than conscience. When we look back, we imagine we would have done differently, but history reminds us how easily morality bends when fear and pride whisper together. Germany was not a nation of monsters. It was a nation of men and women who forgot, one small choice at a time, what it means to see another person as human. Tonight, as you drift further into this story, let the rhythm of history slow your heartbeat. Hear the faint echoes of boots on cobblestones, the rustle of papers signed under lamplight, the murmur of radios, repeating slogans in rooms where truth once lived. Those are the sounds of a civilization losing its soul. Before the camps, before the trains, before the smoke, there were ideas, and ideas, once planted, can grow in any soil that forgets compassion. The seeds of hatred were planted not in 1942, but in hearts unguarded in the 1,920 seconds and 1,930 seconds. They grew quietly, watered by despair and pride, until the harvest came. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a photograph from that time. A crowd in a city square, faces lifted, arms raised in salute. In the corner, one man does not raise his hand. He stands still, eyes calm, perhaps afraid, perhaps simply unwilling. History rarely remembers him, but it should, for in every age, the hope of humanity rests in those who refuse. And so, the story begins not with war, but with words, not with fire, but with faith misplaced. From this point forward, the darkness will deepen before the light returns. But within the shadows, there will always remain those small glimmers of conscience, the quiet hearts who remembered what others forgot. This is the beginning of their world, and of the one that nearly ended ours. The vision of purity. The year is 1933. Across Germany, sound of marching boots has become the rhythm of daily life. Flags bearing the swastika ripple in the cold wind like a new faith. The radio hums with speeches that promise strength, unity, and rebirth. For many, it feels as if chaos has finally given way to order. But beneath the pageantry, something far darker is taking shape. An idea dressed in beauty, built on blood. It began, as so many human tragedies do, with a dream of perfection. Adolf Hitler spoke often of purity, not purity of heart or spirit, but of race. To him, The German people were a chosen family, descended from an ancient and noble stock he called the Aryans. In his vision, every sickness in society, crime, poverty, descent could be cured if the blood of the nation were cleansed. It was a myth older than him, twisted from fragments of pseudoscience, social Darwinism, and centuries of European prejudice. But Hitler gave it a voice, and that voice became law. In universities, professors who once studied medicine or anthropology began writing about skulls, jawlines, and eye color. Charts divided humanity into categories: Nordic, Alpine, Mediterranean, and non-Aryan. Measuring tape replaced morality. Laboratories became altars, where scientists served ideology instead of truth. Words like degenerate and inferior crept into lectures and newspapers. What had once been hatred whispered in alleys was now spoken in classrooms, printed in textbooks, and repeated by children. At the heart of this new faith stood the belief that some lives were worth less than others. Jews, Roma, the disabled, and countless others were declared unfit. They were accused of weakening the nation, polluting its blood, corrupting its art and its soul. And if the nation was a body, Hitler saw them as infection. To heal that body, he said, one must cut away the disease. The imagery was powerful, almost poetic. It cloaked cruelty in the language of health and renewal. Doctors who had once sworn to preserve life found themselves persuaded that killing could be mercy not for the individual, but for the future. Churches, fearful of losing favor or convinced by nationalism, often looked away. Sermons spoke of obedience, not compassion. The moral compass of a nation quietly spun in circles. Children were among the first to be claimed by this vision. In classrooms across Germany, young boys and girls raised their arms in salute before lessons began. They learned songs about loyalty and destiny, recited slogans instead of prayers. The Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls taught them to march, to chant, to believe without question. To doubt was to betray. To feel pity was to show weakness. The future was being reshaped not by soldiers, but by teachers. Propaganda became the heartbeat of the Reich. Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, understood that to control the mind, one must first capture the imagination. Posters appeared on every wall, golden-haired children beside, clean fields, and smiling mothers. Films celebrated sacrifice and purity, heroes who conquered their fears by surrendering their conscience. Even music was rewritten to carry the rhythm of the new Germany. People hummed those tunes without realizing what they were singing, yet not all were convinced. Some looked upon the marches and parades with unease. They sensed that the harmony was too perfect, the smiles too forced. Artists who refused to paint in the approved style were denounced as degenerate. Jewish composers, actors, and writers, once the pride of German culture, were silenced. Books by Freud, Einstein, Mann, and countless others were burned in public squares. Flames danced in the night while students cheered, believing they were purifying their minds. The air that once carried the wisdom of centuries now carried only smoke. For the elderly who remembered the empire, it was bewildering. The Germany they had known, a nation of thinkers, poets, and inventors, was dissolving into spectacle. But fear kept many silent. Those who spoke out were marked as traitors. Neighbors whispered, letters disappeared, and the Gestapo knocked on doors at night. Suspicion became the new currency of survival. Amid this tightening grip, Hitler's personal myth grew. He was no longer just a politician. He became the embodiment of destiny itself. Posters showed his face bathed in light, his hand raised as if in blessing. Children prayed to him before bed. His speeches were broadcast in theaters, where audiences sat in reverent silence. To question him was to question the fatherland. And in that worship, conscience was slowly replaced by obedience. Meanwhile, the persecution of Jews deepened. Though it moved with careful calculation, the regime still wanted to appear civilized to the world. Violence was organized, not chaotic. Jewish families found their businesses boycotted, their professions closed, their names erased from public life. Laws were written with precision so that cruelty would look like order. Jews were forbidden to marry non-Jews, barred from owning farms, excluded from universities. Each new decree chipped away another piece of dignity. Outside Germany, the world watched uneasily. Some politicians dismissed Hitler as a passing fanatic. Others saw him as a necessary barrier against communism. Many Americans admired Germany's apparent revival, its clean streets, disciplined youth, its promise of stability after years of chaos. The newspapers reported both the spectacle and the whispers, but few wanted to believe that civilization itself could breed such evil. It was easier to think of Germany as misguided rather than monstrous. And so the years rolled forward. In the glow of torchlight rallies, Hitler's vision of purity spread beyond Jews to other targets: the mentally ill, the disabled, the poor, the different. The regime launched the T4 program, a secret operation to euthanize those deemed life unworthy of life. Doctors wrote false death certificates. Nurses administered lethal injections. Families received letters saying their loved ones had died of heart failure. The world outside did not yet know, but the system of killing was being perfected, tested on the vulnerable, before it was unleashed on millions. In this Germany, words like mercy and duty had changed their meanings. To be merciful was to eliminate the weak. To be dutiful was to obey without thought. The line between morality and madness had blurred beyond recognition, and yet, in small corners of the country, compassion survived. A priest here, a nurse there, whispered protests, hid a patient, forged a signature. Their courage often cost them their lives, but their quiet defiance glimmered like candlelight in the fog. History would forget most of their names, but their humanity endured where ideology had died. For the Jewish people, each passing year felt like the tightening of an invisible fist. They could still walk the streets, but those streets had changed. Children were taunted in schools, shop windows shattered in the night. Families gathered around dinner tables whispering of visas, of America, of Palestine, of anywhere beyond reach of this madness. Some managed to leave, most did not. In 1938, the illusion of restraint finally broke. The Anschluss absorbed Austria. Germany's reach extended, and with it came humiliation for every Jewish citizen who remained. Old friends turned away. Teachers no longer called on Jewish children in class. That November came Kristallnacht, the night when the mask fell away completely. Thousands of Jewish homes, synagogues, and businesses were attacked. 91 people were murdered, 30,000 sent to camps. Firefighters stood by to protect Aryan property as the flames consumed temples and Torahs. The streets glistened with broken glass, and from that reflection, the world could no longer pretend it did not see. But seeing and acting are not the same. The United States condemned the violence, but did not open its borders. Britain held conferences and issued statements. The League of Nations expressed concern. Concern was not enough. Hitler read the world's hesitation as permission. And so, the dream of racial purity expanded into a plan of conquest. Hitler declared that Germany needed Lebensraum living space for its growing race. The East, he said, was the future. There, among the fields of Poland and the plains of Russia, the Aryan farmer would replace what he called inferior races. It was the same poison, now given the uniform of empire. War would make possible what peace had only prepared. By 1939, the borders trembled again. The swastika had become a shadow stretching across Europe. Hitler's speeches grew colder, his promises bolder. If international Jewry plunges the world into war, he warned, the result will be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. Many dismissed it as rhetoric, the bluster of a tyrant. But his threats were never mere words. They were blueprints. As Germany invaded Poland, the machinery of war merged with the machinery of hate. Soldiers marched, and behind them followed the architects of extermination. In their briefcases were maps, lists, and plans not just for battlefields, but for ghettos and graves. The vision of purity had matured into policy. It no longer needed speeches or applause. It had found its rhythm in efficiency. In quiet towns, Jews were rounded up, rabbis beaten, synagogues burned again, this time without even the pretense of control. The police recorded everything: names, addresses, possessions. Bureaucrats processed human beings as if processing shipments. Each document, each stamp, each ledger entry moved the plan one step closer to its terrible fulfillment. Those who had once cheered the rallies now found themselves bystanders to horror. Some looked away, others joined in. The transformation was complete. A vision that had begun with talk of rebirth had turned into the architecture of annihilation. And yet, in the stillness of memory, we can hear how it began, in words that sounded harmless, even noble. Words about order, unity, pride, and destiny. Words that promised to heal a wounded nation. They began as lullabies and ended as screams. As the 1,930 seconds faded into war, the dream of racial purity hardened into the blueprint of genocide. The future would be written not in ink, but in ash. But for now, the people of Germany slept, lulled by the illusion that greatness had returned. Outside their windows, the night was calm. The trains had not yet begun to move. The smoke had not yet risen. But the air itself was waiting, and history was holding its breath. The machinery of control. The war had begun. On the first day of September 1939, German troops crossed the Polish border beneath a gray morning sky. Tanks rolled like thunder across fields, still wet with dew. Planes screamed above. Villages that had not yet learned to fear the sound. The world would later mark this day as the beginning of the Second World War. But for millions, it marked something more personal, the beginning of years spent under the weight of another man's will. Within weeks, the machinery of conquest settled into place. Behind the soldiers came administrators, police, and officials carrying folders thicker than rifles. They were not there merely to fight. They were there to organize, to count, to register. In every captured town, the same pattern appeared. A new office, a new list, a new set of rules. Signs in Polish were torn down, German decrees nailed to walls. Curfews, confiscations, segregation, all written neatly on paper and stamped with eagles and swastikas. Oppression, when done bureaucratically, feels strangely tidy. Poland was divided, carved like a map drawn in anger. To the west, land was annexed directly into the Reich. To the east, a general government was created, a colony for the unwanted, ruled by Governor Hans Frank. He called it the dustbin of Europe. Into that dustbin, the Nazis began sweeping people. Jewish families were ordered to leave their homes and move into closed districts that soon became ghettos. The largest was Warsaw, where more than 400,000 souls were packed into a few square miles of crumbling streets. A brick wall wound around the district like a tourniquet. Outside it, life continued. Streetcars rang their bells, cafes served coffee. Inside, hunger became the daily rhythm of existence. Food was rationed by race. For every German, over 2,000 calories a day. For every Pole, half that. For every Jew, less than 300. Children scavenged through garbage heaps for potato peels. Smugglers risked their lives carrying bread through cracks in the wall. Those caught were shot on sight. And yet, even here, even in that darkness, people tried to remain human. Teachers held secret classes. Musicians played in courtyards. Rabbis whispered prayers beside hidden candles. To remember, beauty became a form of resistance. Elsewhere in Poland, the Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units of the SS followed the army like a shadow. Their orders were precise: seek out political enemies, intellectuals, clergy, and Jews. At first, They claimed it was about security. Soon it was clear it was about annihilation. Villages were surrounded at dawn. Men, women, and children forced to dig trenches that became their graves. By the end of 1941, more than 1 million people had been murdered this way. It was mass murder conducted not by monsters, but by men who wore uniforms, ate lunch, and wrote reports before dinner. The machinery of control was not only mechanical, it was moral, built from obedience and silence. Back inside Germany, life looked almost orderly. Trains ran on time. Factories produced with precision. The Gestapo maintained its invisible presence. No one quite knew who worked for them, and that was the point. Fear no longer needed to shout. It could whisper. A careless joke, a rumor of disloyalty, a letter opened by mistake. Any of these could end a life. Neighbors learned to speak in half sentences. Children were encouraged to report suspicious talk at home. Trust itself became contraband. The Gestapo, the secret state police, functioned less like an army and more like a web. Its power rested not on numbers, but on informants, ordinary citizens, who betrayed one another for safety, or favor, or simple spite. Most arrests began not with officers, but with rumors. A teacher overheard, a shopkeeper offended, a friend jealous. Once accused, there was no defense, no appeal. You were swallowed by paperwork filed, stamped, transported, and gone. A society can survive hunger, but not the loss of trust. That was Hitler's true victory at home. In the camps, the system of control reached its perfection. Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald names that began as detention sites for political opponents now expanded into a network across Europe. Each camp was its own world, ruled by commandants who answered only upward, never outward. Prisoners were reduced to numbers, uniforms to stripes. Discipline was absolute. Guards could kill at will, but more often they killed slowly through labor, through hunger, through humiliation. The purpose was not only to punish, but to erase identity. When a man forgets his name, he forgets he is human. Inside those barbed perimeters, experiments in dehumanization were tested with chilling efficiency. Prisoners were forced to build the walls that confined them, to dig ditches they would later fill, to salute the very men who tormented them. Work began before dawn and ended only when the sun fell behind the watchtowers. Those who collapsed were beaten. Those who stood were given one more day to suffer. The sound of boots on gravel, the bark of orders, the rattle of chains, these became the rhythm of their existence. And through it all, the record keepers wrote everything down. Paperwork transformed agony into data, making cruelty feel organized, almost respectable. The Nazis called it Ordnung, order. Every act of terror was justified as necessary for order. Every regulation, every number tattooed on flesh, every train schedule leading east was part of that order. 1,000 officials performed their tasks without ever seeing a victim. One signed transport papers, another checked cargo weights, another balanced ledgers. Together they created a machinery that ran on fragments of obedience. When everyone does a small wrong, no one feels responsible for the great one. Even within this system, there were hierarchies of survival. Some prisoners, often those who spoke German or possessed useful skills, were made into kapos, overseers who supervised others. They were victims, yet forced into cruelty, a perverse mirror of the world outside. The SS understood psychology. Well, divide and rule. Make the oppressed enforce their own oppression. It is cheaper than bullets and more efficient than mercy. Beyond the camps, the Nazi bureaucracy turned its gaze to occupied nations. In France, Denmark, the Netherlands, Greece, wherever the swastika flew, German officials demanded lists of Jews, census data, addresses. Local police often complied. Some resisted quietly, falsifying records or warning families in advance. But for many, cooperation seemed safer. Obedience is contagious, and the machinery of control thrived on cooperation. willing or not. The deeper the Reich extended, the more it resembled a single great factory, a factory for obedience. Each citizen, each soldier, each clerk became a cog. The raw materials were fear and hatred. The finished product was silence. From Berlin's marble offices to the frozen edges of the Eastern Front, everything served the same purpose: to make millions act in concert without question. That is how genocide begins, not with frenzy, but with paperwork done well. Inside Germany, propaganda filled the air like perfume. Films portrayed smiling farmers and heroic soldiers. Posters showed clean-limbed youths and content mothers. Reality was replaced by theater. While the front lines burned, Berlin's cinemas stayed full. People preferred newsreels of victory to the truth. Comfort is the most persuasive lie of all. Still, not every heart was lost. In small towns, priests whispered doubts from pulpits, then vanished. A few army officers, disturbed by what they saw in Poland and Russia, sent anonymous letters of protest. Ordinary women left loaves of bread on the doorsteps of Jewish families after midnight. Tiny gestures, unrecorded, unseen, but in them lived the last remnants of conscience. The machinery of control could command bodies, but not every soul. As the war widened, France conquered, the Low Countries occupied. Britain, under bombardment, the Nazi state reached its zenith of confidence. Within the glow of victory, plans grew bolder. The ghettos were overflowing, the camps multiplying. But for Hitler and his ministers, the question was not how to stop the suffering, but how to make it more efficient. Meetings were held, memos circulated. Words like evacuation, resettlement, special treatment became euphemisms that hid murder behind bureaucracy. Language itself became a collaborator. In the streets of Warsaw, the ghetto walls loomed higher. Inside, families huddled in apartments meant for one and shared by 10. Disease spread faster than rumors. Yet in that suffocating world, a kind of courage blossomed. Teachers teaching without books, musicians playing in secret, rabbis writing diaries by candlelight so that someone, someday, might know what happened. Their notes were hidden in milk cans buried under rubble. History, even under tyranny, finds a way to breathe. Meanwhile, the trains kept moving east. They carried soldiers, supplies, and soon, something else. Each timetable, each manifest, each stamped authorization tightened the gears of a system that no one dared name aloud. The machinery was ready. All it needed was the next instruction. And so, in the winter of 1941, that instruction arrived. The plan would have a new name, a final solution to the Jewish question. It would require every wheel, every clerk, every mile of track already built. The bureaucracy that once managed order would now manage death. For now, though, the world slept unaware. In the quiet of occupied cities, snow fell softly on rooftops, covering the scars of bombings, muffling the footsteps of patrols. The machinery of control hummed beneath the silence, a monstrous rhythm of pens scratching, trains whistling, typewriters clattering. An empire of obedience was in motion. No one yet saw the scale of what it would do. But history was already trembling, like a distant train approaching through the fog. Laws of exclusion. Germany, 1935. The country was a sected escrit, glowed with the illusion of strength. Factories smoked again. The army marched proudly, and the voice of the Führer filled the airwaves like a sermon. To many Germans, it seemed as though the chaos of the past had been banished. There was order now, discipline, certainty, but in the corners of that order behind the flags and parades, whole lives were quietly being erased. The Jewish people had lived in German lands for centuries. They had fought in the Great War, served in universities, built businesses, written music, discovered scientific truths. They were woven into the nation's story. But by the middle of the 1932, they were no longer considered Germans at all. They had become ghosts within their own homes, unrecognized by the laws they had once obeyed. It began with whispers of exclusion. Don't shop there. Don't greet them. Don't hire them. Then came laws that turned whispers into commands. In September 1935, at the Nazi Party's annual rally in Nuremberg, Hitler announced two new decrees: the Reich Citizenship Law and the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor. Their words were written with the precision of bureaucrats, but carried the venom of centuries. From that moment, being German was no longer a matter of loyalty or birth, it was a matter of blood. Jews were stripped of citizenship. They were declared subjects of the state, not members of it. They could not marry or even have relations with those deemed Aryan. They could not display the national flag or employ German servants. The state had drawn a line between human and unhuman and written it into law. But the cruelty of those laws did not lie only in their restrictions. It lay in their logic. The government created entire offices dedicated to tracing ancestry, demanding proof of pure blood. Families dug through generations of baptism records, birth certificates, and marriage papers, searching for proof that they were allowed to belong. People who had never thought of race as a category suddenly found it printed on their identity cards. With every form filled, every signature submitted, society learned to measure worth in fractions: half Jew, quarter Jew, Mischling. The mathematics of hate replaced the language of community. For Jewish families, the world shrank one rule at a time. Doctors lost their patients, professors lost their classrooms, lawyers were forbidden to argue in court, shops were painted with yellow stars, Jewish actors were banned from the stage, authors' books removed from libraries. Even pets were forbidden to be owned by Jews. It was as if the government were trying to erase every trace of their existence, not only from the present, but from memory itself. The laws reached into the lives of children. Classrooms once filled with laughter became places of humiliation. Jewish students were forced to sit apart, mocked during lessons about race and heredity. Teachers who had once praised their intelligence now avoided their eyes. Friendships quietly dissolved under the weight of fear. It was safer not to know someone the government had marked. The Gestapo watched from the shadows, but they seldom needed to intervene. Ordinary citizens did the work of exclusion themselves. Landlords refused tenants. Shopkeepers turned customers away. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid old acquaintances. Hatred, when made legal, no longer needs to shout. It simply follows the rules. And all the while, propaganda sang its lullaby. Posters showed smiling farmers, clean and strong, beside warnings of racial contamination. Films portrayed Jews as cunning or diseased, as threats to purity. Newspapers published pseudo-scientific diagrams of skulls and noses, claiming to show the difference between Aryan virtue and Jewish deceit. The lies were constant, repeated until they sounded like truth. When people hear the same story often enough, they stop asking whether it is true. They simply absorb it, as one absorbs the weather. Outside Germany, few understood the depth of what was happening. The 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin offered a vision of peace and progress. The city was polished and smiling. Foreign journalists were guided along clean boulevards. Anti-Semitic signs were temporarily removed. Jewish citizens were ordered to stay quiet. Visitors marveled at Germany's efficiency, its pride, its sense of renewal. The world applauded, unaware that beneath the decorations lay despair. But the mask could not hide reality for long. After the games, the laws grew harsher. Jewish children were expelled from schools entirely. Jewish musicians could no longer play in orchestras. Jewish art was labeled degenerate and displayed in mocking exhibitions. The Reich Chamber of Culture decided what was acceptable to think and who was allowed to create. Art itself had to serve ideology. Creativity was replaced by conformity. Imagination became a crime. The church, once a moral refuge, stood uncertain. Some priests spoke out and were silenced. Others remained still. telling themselves it was not their fight. The silence of the righteous became another instrument of the regime. In Germany's great cathedrals, prayers continued, but the words for compassion and justice were whispered so softly that no one could hear them. In small towns, life narrowed to fear. Families began to vanish. A teacher dismissed. A neighbor moved away. A shop suddenly boarded up. No explanations, only silence. At first, people noticed. Later, they stopped asking questions. The absence of others became normal. Normality, that most dangerous word, cloaked the growing darkness. Some tried to leave. They sold their homes, packed what they could, stood in endless lines for visas that never came. But the world beyond Germany's borders was closing its doors. The United States, still weary from the Great Depression, limited immigration. Britain hesitated. Even in neutral countries, consulates turned people away. Ships left Europe full of desperate souls and returned, still full, with passengers denied refuge. The planet was shrinking for those who needed safety most. By 1938, the tension that had been building in silence exploded into violence. On the night of November 9th, the streets of Germany and Austria filled with the sound of glass shattering. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Synagogues burned, while fire brigades stood idle, instructed to protect only Aryan property. Storefronts were smashed, sacred scrolls torn and trampled, cemeteries desecrated. 91 people were murdered. More than 30,000 were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The glow of the fires lit up the sky for miles, a reflection of a nation's conscience consumed. After that night, there was no longer any pretense. The laws of exclusion had achieved their purpose. Jews were no longer neighbors or citizens. They were outsiders, stripped of protection, subject to violence at will. The machinery of control that had been built so carefully now shifted into a new gear. The next step would no longer be legal, but logistical. And yet, within that descent, there were still moments of humanity. A Christian neighbor who hid a Torah in her attic, a school friend who slipped food through a window, a priest who baptized Jewish children to disguise them, knowing the danger. Acts so small they seemed invisible, yet powerful enough to remind the world that even in darkness, choice remains. But for the great majority, obedience triumphed. The German people had learned to accept the laws of exclusion not as cruelty, but as order. And when cruelty becomes order, mercy begins to sound like treason. By the dawn of 1939, Jewish life in Germany was no longer life, it was endurance. Each family lived by a list of restrictions. No radios, no typewriters, no bicycles, no public parks, no theaters, no telephones, no citizenship, even the Genocideship, right to breathe freely in the streets of one's own homeland, was now considered a privilege. The laws had done their work. A society once known for music, philosophy, and art had legislated humanity out of existence. The rest of the world still hoped that diplomacy might restrain Hitler, that reason might appeal to him, but he was no longer listening to the world. His eyes were on the map. The space he demanded for his pure race lay to the east, and the borders of that world were already trembling. The ghettos were waiting to be built. The trains were waiting to be filled. The forms were waiting to be stamped. And the laws written so carefully, enforced so faithfully, had already prepared the minds of millions to accept what would come next. The fire had been lit, and the world had yet to see the smoke. The night of broken glass. The year was 1938, and the illusion of peace in Germany had begun to crack. For years, persecution had moved like a slow tide, laws, restrictions, humiliation. But now, the tide was turning into a wave. The calm language of bureaucracy was about to give way to the sound of breaking glass. It began with a single death. In early November, a young Jewish boy named Herschel Grinspan stood in a Paris street, trembling with rage and grief. Days earlier, his parents and thousands of other Polish Jews had been expelled from Germany, forced onto trains, stripped of belongings, left in a no-man's land between borders. Letters from his family reached him in despair, describing hunger and humiliation. In that moment of hopelessness, Herschel entered the German embassy in Paris and shot a diplomat named Ernst von Rath. The diplomat died 2 days later. The Nazi regime had been waiting for a spark. This was it. On the night of November 9th, 1938, the storm broke. It began with orders whispered down through party channels, to police, to the SS, to local officials. The instructions were clear: unleash fury, but make it look spontaneous. Let the world see German anger. And so, as darkness fell, the first stones were thrown. Across Germany and Austria, synagogues burned. Windows of Jewish shops shattered under boots and clubs. The streets glittered with fragments of faith, of families, of futures. That night, Germany's cities did not sleep. They echoed with the sound of destruction, flames consuming scrolls older than the nation itself, pianos thrown into the street, Torahs trampled into mud. Firefighters stood by, under orders to protect only Aryan property. In Berlin, the orange glow from burning synagogues reflected in the river like a second sunrise, a sunrise born of hatred. They called it Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. But it was more than glass that shattered. It was the last illusion that Jews could ever belong, that decency still had a place in the Reich. 91 Jews were murdered. More than 1,400 synagogues were destroyed. 30,000 men were arrested and sent to concentration camps, Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen. There they were beaten, humiliated, some killed outright. Businesses were looted, homes invaded. Women and children huddled in fear as boots thundered down their streets. By morning, the cities looked as though a storm had passed, but the smell of smoke lingered. Ash settled over rooftops and doorsteps, marking where prayers had once been spoken. And the government, rather than punishing the attackers, blamed the victims. They fined the Jewish community 1 billion marks for the damage caused by their own persecution. Insurance claims were confiscated by the state. It was cruelty carried out with administrative precision, hatred measured by ledger. For ordinary Germans, Kristallnacht was a turning point, a night when silence became complicity. Some watched the fires with unease, others with indifference. A few wept quietly behind drawn curtains. Many said nothing at all. Fear was a powerful teacher, and by 1938, it had taught its lesson well. To speak was to endanger oneself. The cost of compassion had become too high. But for the Jewish people, that night was more than terror, it was revelation. Whatever illusions had remained were gone. They understood that what had begun as prejudice had become policy, and what was policy would soon become extermination. The path forward led only toward darkness. In the days after Kristallnacht, the regime worked quickly to make the destruction appear lawful. Debris was cleared, glass swept away, shops reopened under new ownership. Propaganda spun the story as public outrage against an imagined Jewish conspiracy. The world read the headlines, and though diplomats protested, no nation intervened. The United States recalled its ambassador but refused to change its immigration limits. Britain condemned the violence, yet offered refuge to only a few, most famously, the Kindertransport, which brought several thousand Jewish children to safety, but left their parents behind. It was a gesture of humanity, but one that could not match the scale of despair. For Jews still in Germany, the message was clear: there was no future here. Emigration became a desperate dream. Families sold heirlooms for scraps of foreign currency, queued outside consulates that would never call their names. Ships like the Street Louis carried hundreds towards safety, only to be turned away from Cuba and the United States, forced back toward Europe. For many aboard, it was a voyage from hope to death. As 1,938 turned into 1,939, the walls of Europe began to close. Austria had been absorbed. Czechoslovakia lay dismembered. German troops marched freely across borders once thought sacred. Newspapers printed maps shaded in black, showing the Reich expanding like a spreading stain. And with each conquest came new victims, new ghettos, new lists. Still, there were Germans who tried, quietly, to help. A farmer hiding a child in his barn, a nurse forging a birth certificate, a schoolteacher smuggling letters across the border. Their acts did not stop the tide, but they mattered. They proved that conscience, though buried, was not dead. History rarely remembers their names, but their courage lingers like a faint candle in a long corridor of darkness. For Hitler, Kristallnacht was more than vengeance, it was rehearsal. It proved that violence could be unleashed with precision, that the world would watch and do nothing. The machine was ready. The nation had learned to obey. The police, the courts, the press, even the churches all now played their roles. The last obstacles to total control had been swept away with the glass. Within months, new orders were signed. Jewish children were expelled from public schools entirely. Property was confiscated, passports stamped with red J's, marking their owners for exclusion wherever they fled. The country that once boasted of Goethe, Beethoven, and Einstein had reduced identity to a letter of the alphabet. And then, in September 1939, as dawn broke over Poland, the first shells fell. The war that would consume the world had begun. But for Europe's Jews, the war had already started on that November night when their synagogues burned and their neighbors turned away. The fire that consumed those houses of worship was the same fire that would soon engulf a continent. For the rest of the world, Kristallnacht was a warning. For the Nazis, it was a test passed. The streets were silent again. The glass had been swept away, the fires extinguished. But in that silence, something irreversible had begun. It was the silence before the storm, before the trains, before the ghettos, before the ashes. And somewhere in that silence, beneath the smoldering ruins of a synagogue, a charred fragment of a Torah lay open its letters, half burned, but still legible. They read, "Remember, a world at war. The morning of September 1st, 1939, dawned cold and pale over the fields of Poland. Villagers woke to the distant rumble of thunder. Only, it wasn't thunder. It was tanks. Columns of steel and soldiers moved through the mist, their tracks grinding the earth. Planes roared overhead, dropping death onto cities that had not yet seen war. Within hours, the German army had crossed the Polish border, and Europe's uneasy peace shattered like glass under a boot. The invasion was swift, methodical, and merciless. It was not a war of soldiers against soldiers. It was a war of ideology against humanity. Behind the German army marched a second force, one not listed in battle reports, the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units of the SS. Their orders came directly from Berlin. They were not there to fight the Polish army, but to eliminate enemies of the Reich, Jews, intellectuals, priests, teachers, anyone who could preserve culture or conscience. Within days, villages vanished, their men shot in ditches, their women and children driven into ghettos or forests. The air smelled of smoke and fear. For Hitler, Poland was not simply a conquest. It was the laboratory for his vision of Lebensraum, living space, where the so-called Aryan race would flourish by removing those he deemed unworthy. The invasion was the first step toward reshaping Europe itself. The SS called it Germanization. In practice, it meant cleansing the land of its people. Churches were closed, synagogues burned, schools dismantled. Thousands were expelled from their homes and replaced by German settlers, arriving with official papers that turned theft into policy. Cities like Warsaw, Lodz, Krakow, and Lublin fell quickly. But what followed was not peace, it was transformation. German administrators arrived with briefcases full of regulations, not rifles. They brought pens, not bombs, and yet their work destroyed millions. The conquered land was divided in two. Western Poland was annexed directly into the Reich. The eastern portion became the general government ruled by Hans Frank, a man who described it as the dustbin of Europe. In that dustbin, a new experiment began, one that would soon spread across the continent. Within months, the first ghettos were created. At first, they were presented as temporary measures, meant to protect Jews from the violence of war. But behind that excuse lay a darker plan. The ghettos were not sanctuaries, they were holding pens. Entire communities were forced to move within designated city districts, surrounded by walls and guarded by soldiers. Food was rationed, medicine scarce, disease rampant. In Warsaw alone, more than 400,000 Jews were trapped within 3 square miles of crumbling streets. Each person was allowed only a few pounds of belongings, clothing, a pan, perhaps a family photograph. The rest was confiscated, catalogued, and claimed by the Reich. Life inside the ghettos was an act of survival measured in hours. Hunger was constant. Cold was a companion. Every morning, carts carried away bodies of those who had starved overnight. Yet, even there, life refused to vanish. Rabbis held secret prayers. Teachers conducted underground schools. Musicians played on corners, reminding listeners that beauty could still exist. Families gathered in cellars to share crumbs of bread and whispers of hope. Resistance was not always a gun in hand. Sometimes it was the simple act of singing a song. Outside the walls, the rest of the world moved deeper into war. Britain and France declared hostilities on Germany, but their early efforts were slow. The Soviet Union, bound by its pact with Hitler, invaded Poland from the east, slicing the nation in two. Between them, Poland disappeared from the map. Its people, however, did not vanish. They were absorbed into the machinery of empire, divided by race and utility. The Germans took the western lands. The Soviets deported thousands eastward to Siberia, and in between, caught in the gray zone of occupation. The Jewish population endured the full weight of both ideologies, communism on one side, annihilation on the other. As 1,940 arrived, the war spread like wildfire. Denmark and Norway fell, then the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and finally France. Europe lay under the shadow of the swastika. Everywhere the same pattern, repeated registration, isolation, confiscation. Jews were forced to wear yellow stars, their businesses seized, their movement restricted. The ghettos of Poland became blueprints for a continental system. Bureaucrats perfected the art of oppression. Train timetables were rewritten to accommodate new transports. Europe was being organized into a single, obedient organism, one that fed on the lives of the innocent. Inside Germany, life looked almost normal. The shops were open, cinemas full, radios humming with victory marches. But normality had become an illusion built on absence. The country's conscience had been hollowed out. Letters from soldiers on the Eastern Front spoke of victories, but some hinted at darker deeds. Villages burned, columns of civilians shot. The rumors grew, but few dared to ask questions. To know was dangerous. To care was worse. The Nazis did not yet call their plan the final solution. Not officially. In these early years, the killing was still fragmented shootings, starvation, neglect, but the intent was clear, and the methods were evolving. The SS began experimenting with gas vans, sealed trucks where exhaust fumes were piped inward. Victims suffocated quietly as the engine ran. The vans were mobile, efficient, and impersonal. Each innovation brought the regime one step closer to industrialized murder. In the occupied territories, collaboration became a currency. Local police forces, administrators, and even neighbors participated in the roundups. Some did so out of fear, others out of greed or prejudice. But there were also the brave: Poles, Danes, Dutch, French, Greeks, who risked everything to hide or protect their Jewish neighbors. Their numbers were few, but their courage immense. They proved that in every system of evil, there are still individuals who refuse to obey. By the summer of 1941, Hitler turned eastward again. On June 22nd, he launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, the largest military operation in history. Millions of German soldiers crossed the border, followed once again by the Einsatzgruppen. Behind the front lines, entire Jewish communities were wiped out. Men, women, and children were herded into forests, made to dig their own graves, then shot. In places like Babi Yar, Ponary, and Rumbula, tens of thousands were murdered in a single day. The sound of gunfire replaced the sound of prayer. The soil itself became a graveyard. At first, the world did not know. Reports reached London and Washington, but the scale seemed unbelievable. Civilized nations could not yet imagine such methodical cruelty. Yet, for those trapped in occupied Europe, it was all too real. Letters vanished, families disappeared, villages emptied overnight. The war that had begun with flags and speeches had transformed into something far more monstrous, a war against existence itself. Within the ghettos, starvation deepened. In Warsaw, rations for Jews were reduced to a few ounces of bread and potatoes per day. Disease swept through the cramped alleys. Still, the spirit of endurance flickered. Secret libraries circulated, banned books. Underground newspapers recorded events for future generations. Smugglers, many of them children, crawled through sewers or scaled walls to bring food. Each loaf of bread carried into the ghetto was a victory against despair. But the Nazi system was tightening. In Berlin, offices buzzed with new plans: evacuations, resettlements, special treatments. Euphemisms became masks for murder. The Reich Main Security Office, led by Reinhard Heydrich, issued directives that began to sound chillingly organized. The Jewish question, it said, required a territorial solution. Deportations would soon begin on a massive scale. The ghettos were no longer temporary. They were waiting rooms for death. In January 1942, a conference would be held at a villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee. There, among polished wood and silver pens, men would sit around a table and formalize what had already begun. But that meeting lay ahead. In 1941, the pieces were still falling into place. The camps of Chelmno and Belzec were under construction. Engineers and architects designed crematoria as calmly as they once designed bridges. The machinery of genocide was being built in plain sight, disguised as logistics. And yet, even as the darkness spread, light persisted faint, fragile, but real. In the ghettos, people married, children were born, songs were written. A man might play a violin beside a pile of rubble, and for a moment, the music made the walls disappear. Hope is not rational. It survives where reason ends. In a world that sought to erase them, the Jews of Europe continued to affirm life, even if only for another day. Meanwhile, across the oceans, the United States remained cautious. Isolationist sentiment ran deep. Immigration quotas stayed tight. President Roosevelt condemned Nazi brutality, but hesitated to act beyond diplomacy. Britain, battered and besieged, focused on survival. The voices of Jewish leaders pleading for intervention were drowned out by the roar of war. The world had not yet found its moral footing. By late 1941, Germany's victories seemed unstoppable. France was occupied, the Soviet Union collapsing, and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor would soon pull America into the conflict. But in the East, where the SS ruled with unchecked authority, something even greater than war was unfolding: the systematic transformation of ideology into annihilation. In the forests of Ukraine, Lithuania, and Belarus, the earth itself seemed to bleed. Villages that had stood for centuries vanished in smoke. No army reported these battles. No maps recorded them. They were wars against memory, fought with bullets and shovels. The perpetrators photographed their own crimes, smiling beside pits filled with bodies. Some sent those photos home as trophies, never imagining that one day they would serve as evidence. The face of evil had grown familiar, ordinary, uniformed, unremarkable. In Warsaw, the ghetto's wall cast its long shadow over a city pretending not to see. On cold nights, families huddled in cellars, whispering rumors of extermination camps far to the east. "It cannot be true," they told each other. No one could build a place just for death. But in hidden offices, engineers were already drawing blueprints that would prove them wrong. The world was at war, but only a few understood that this war was unlike any before. It was not about borders or resources. It was about the idea that some lives did not deserve to exist. That belief had begun as a whisper, then became law, then fire. Now, it marched under banners and filled the air with the sound of trains. Each train carried a promise, written in the calm language of bureaucracy: resettlement to the east. Each passenger carried a suitcase filled with hope, and at the end of the line, that hope would vanish into smoke. The guns thundered across Europe. The sky itself seemed to tremble. But within that vast chaos, the machinery of genocide moved quietly, efficiently, and without pause. The war gave it cover, ideology gave it purpose, and together, they forged the darkest chapter in human history. By the close of 1941, millions were already gone by bullet, by hunger, by cold. Yet the greatest horror was still to come. The killing fields of the East were only the beginning. The camps, the gas, the ash, those would come next. And as the world's armies clashed over cities and skies, another war was being waged in silence, a war for the soul of humanity, one that had already begun to lose. The Holocaust by bullets, summer 1941. The war on the Eastern Front had just begun. The forests of Poland and Ukraine were lush and green. Wheat fields rippled under a blue sky. Villagers rose early to tend their crops, unaware that history's darkest chapter was about to unfold in those very meadows. The guns of Operation Barbarossa had opened not only a military campaign, but a crusade, a war of annihilation, conceived in ideology long before a single shot was fired. Following the Wehrmacht's advance were men who did not wear the same uniforms as ordinary soldiers. They moved in black coats, their boots polished, their insignia gleaming silver in the sun. They were the Einsatzgruppen, the task forces, hand-picked units of the SS under Reinhard Heydrich and Heinrich Himmler. Their mission was simple and monstrous: to cleanse the newly conquered lands of Jews, communists, Roma, and anyone deemed a threat to Nazi racial purity. But behind the bureaucratic words lay a single meaning: mass murder. At first, they followed behind the army, interrogating mayors and priests, collecting lists of names. Then the orders changed. No more lists, no more courts. The Jews of the East are to be executed, the directives said. The language was cold, the handwriting neat. The men reading it were clerks, policemen, school teachers in civilian life. They had families, mortgages, hobbies. Yet when told to shoot, they obeyed. The first massacres began in Lithuania and Latvia. In the small town of Kovno, hundreds of Jewish men were gathered in a courtyard. They were told they were being resettled. Instead, they were marched to the nearby 7th Fort, lined up before a trench, and gunned down. Within days, thousands were dead. In Riga, in Minsk, in Vilnius, the pattern repeated: arrest, march, dig, shoot, bury. The rhythm of genocide was established: mechanical, methodical, merciless. By autumn, it had spread across the entire front. In Ukraine, the city of Kiev fell to German troops, and the Jews were ordered to assemble with their belongings at the corner of Melnikov and Doktorivska streets. The notice promised resettlement. The people obeyed: elderly couples clutching canes, mothers carrying infants, men supporting the blind. They walked through the city, guarded by soldiers, until they reached the ravine called Babi Yar. There, over 2 days, September 29 and 30, 1941, more than 33,000 men, women, and children were shot. The gunfire echoed across the valley, mingling with the cries of the dying. When it ended, the earth itself seemed to moan. The soldiers buried the pit, leveled the ground, and returned to camp. Official reports recorded it as a successful action. The Holocaust by bullets had begun. It was genocide, carried out not by gas chambers or machinery, but by hand, one bullet at a time. Men stood face to face with their victims. They heard the pleas, saw the fear, smelled the blood, and still they fired. How did they endure it? Some drank heavily. Others told themselves they were following orders. A few tried to look away, aiming into the air, though that too was dangerous. To refuse was to risk joining the condemned. Obedience had become survival for the killers as well. Eyewitnesses described the scenes: trenches stretching for hundreds of yards, mothers embracing children as shots rang out, soldiers loading new magazines as if in routine practice. Local collaborators, police, militias, and volunteers assisted eagerly, sometimes out of old prejudices, sometimes out of greed for the victims' clothing and possessions. Anti-Jewish hatred, centuries old, found new permission under the swastika. The Nazis did not need to convince everyone to kill. They needed only to convince enough to help. In towns like WWII in Poland, the violence was intimate. Neighbors turned against neighbors. On a hot July day in 1941, the Jews of WWII were herded into a barn by their Polish townsmen, not Germans this time, and burned alive. The smoke from that barn rose like a question mark over Europe. How could ordinary people do this? Historians would argue for decades, but those who lived it remembered only the screams. Across the countryside, smaller massacres unfolded daily. 10 here, 50 there, 100 in the next village. Bureaucrats in Berlin received tidy summaries. Asterisk, 1,274 executed. Asterisk, 3,618 cleansed. The reports read like agricultural statistics. Between the summer of 1941 and the winter of 1942, over 1 million Jews were murdered in this way, without camps, without gas, only bullets and silence. The Einsatzgruppen were not alone. 4 main units, A, B, C, and D, operated across the Eastern Front, supported by auxiliary police battalions and the Wehrmacht itself. Officially, the army claimed ignorance. In truth, many officers witnessed or even participated. At Brest-Litovsk, soldiers filmed shootings on personal cameras, posing beside the bodies. Letters home described special duties. Some justified it as revenge against Bolsheviks. Others admitted the horror, but said nothing. War had blurred morality until only orders remained. By winter, the scale of killing began to weigh on the perpetrators. Even hardened men found the constant shooting unbearable. Himmler himself visited a massacre near Minsk and turned pale at the sight, nearly fainting. But instead of stopping it, he sought efficiency. He ordered his subordinates to find a cleaner method, one that spared the shooter's nerves. This search for psychological convenience would lead directly to the invention of stationary gas chambers. Thus, the Holocaust by bullets became the prototype for the industrial genocide that followed. Yet, in 1941 and 1942, the killing fields were everywhere: forests, quarries, ravines. Each became a grave. Villagers sometimes found the ground heaving days later, the wounded buried alive beneath thin soil. The smell lingered for weeks. Children playing nearby stumbled upon human remains, but fear kept mouths closed. To speak was to die. There were witnesses, though Catholic priests, peasants, escaped prisoners who later told what they saw. They described how the victims were forced to strip naked, surrender jewelry, and march in groups toward pits. Men went first, then women, then children. Infants were often thrown into the air and shot mid-fall, a grotesque display of marksmanship. The perpetrators smoked, joked, took photographs. Evil had lost all ceremony. Among the rare acts of courage stood individuals like Father Patrick Desbois, who decades later would travel village to village across Ukraine, documenting the unmarked graves, interviewing the aged witnesses. Thanks to such efforts, the world learned that behind the famous camps lay thousands of forgotten killing sites, each one a wound in the landscape. Inside Germany, these events were cloaked in euphemisms: anti-partisan operations, security actions. The press spoke of pacifying regions. Civilians, though uneasy, preferred not to ask questions. The regime understood that silence was its greatest ally. When a neighbor returned from the front with blood on his uniform, no one inquired whose blood it was. But the killings did not stop at Jews. Roma families, Soviet POWs, the disabled, and political opponents were also executed in vast numbers. The logic of hatred, once unleashed, needed constant victims. The ideology of racial purity demanded perpetual cleansing. By late 1941, new techniques emerged. The SS introduced mobile gas vans, large, sealed trucks, where exhaust fumes were redirected into the cargo hold. Victims were loaded under the pretext of relocation. Within minutes, the noise of the engine replaced their cries. When the doors opened, silence poured out. Drivers smoked cigarettes as they unloaded corpses. Some complained about the smell, not the act. The technology of murder was advancing. In the ghettos, rumors spread of these killings. Letters smuggled out spoke of entire villages, liquidated. Yet many refused to believe. Surely they cannot kill everyone, people said. Surely the world would not allow it. Hope clung stubbornly to disbelief. But in the forests, the graves deepened. Resistance began to stir. In Lithuania and Belarus, small groups of Jews escaped the roundups, hiding in woods, forming partisan bands. They sabotaged railways, rescued others, struck at patrols. Their weapons were few, their odds hopeless. But defiance itself became a declaration. We will not die in silence. Among them were women and children, messengers, smugglers, the invisible army of the persecuted. Their courage could not stop the genocide, but it preserved a fragment of human dignity amid ruin. As the massacres continued, German photographers documented their achievements. Albums labeled Holiday in the East contained images of soldiers laughing beside piles of bodies. Some mailed the pictures home as souvenirs. In those photographs, history glimpses the banality of evil smiling faces, casual poses, death treated as ordinary work. The humanity of the perpetrators had been replaced by habit. Meanwhile, the world beyond the front remained unaware. Reports reached London and Washington through diplomats and resistance networks, but they seemed too grotesque to believe. The scale defied comprehension. Governments filed the evidence away for later. Later came too late. By the spring of 1942, the killing by bullets reached its peak. Entire Jewish populations in Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, and Ukraine had been erased. The Einsatzgruppen's own records discovered after the war listed nearly 1.3 million Jews murdered, and these were only the ones recorded. Each line of their typed reports represented a village erased, a family gone, a language silenced. From the killer's perspective, it was a success. From humanity's, it was the abyss. In Berlin, bureaucrats analyzed the numbers with pride. But Himmler and Heydrich faced a practical dilemma. Bullets were expensive, ammunition needed at the front, and the psychological toll on shooters remained high. They wanted something more efficient, less visible. The final solution, they decided, must become a system, not a series of actions. Thus, in 1942, construction accelerated on permanent death camps, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and the expansion of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Holocaust by bullets had proven that mass murder was possible. The camps would prove it could be perfected. Still, the fields of the East kept their silence. Villagers tilled soil that concealed bones. Rain washed away traces of blood. Decades later, farmers would unearth fragments of clothing, children's shoes, bits of jewelry rusted with time. The earth had become a ledger written in ash and bone. For the survivors who passed through those regions, memory was both curse and duty. Some hid in cellars beneath the very homes of their persecutors. Others joined Soviet partisans or wandered through forests for years. They emerged skeletal, their eyes hollow, their voices soft. When they told their stories, many listeners could not bear to believe them. Yet they spoke, because silence would have been another death. In the ruins of those villages, birds returned, grass grew, and life resumed. Children played where trenches once yawned. The world moved on, but beneath every step lay a story unfinished. The Holocaust by bullets was not confined to one place or moment. It was scattered across thousands of fields, an invisible cemetery stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Each mound of earth whispered the same word: witness. For those who study it now, the horror lies not only in the numbers, but in the intimacy. No distance, no machinery separated victim and killer. It was the eye, meeting the eye, the hand pulling the trigger, the heartbeat of one, ending the heartbeat of another. In that proximity, humanity confronted itself and failed. As the front lines pushed eastward and winter returned, the killing slowed only to change form. The trains began to roll toward the new camps, their smoke blending with the snow. The soldiers of the Einsatzgruppen were reassigned. Some became administrators of the extermination centers. Others returned home, resuming lives of normality. They kissed their wives, read bedtime stories to children, and never spoke of what they had done. The forests kept their secrets, until decades later, when old men and women pointed to the trees and said quietly, "They died there." The Holocaust by bullets had ended, but its echoes continued. Echoes of gunfire swallowed by wind, of prayers cut short, of silence thick as soil. It was the prelude to the gas chambers, the overture of annihilation. And though time has softened the landscape, the earth still remembers. In the stillness of those fields, where larks sing again and sunflowers sway, one can almost hear a heartbeat beneath the ground, faint, steady, unforgotten. It belongs to the million souls who were shot, one by one, under an open sky that saw everything and said nothing. The conference by the lake. The winter of 1942 settled cold and gray across Europe. Rivers froze, rail lines lay stiff beneath snow, and the smoke of war hung low over the continent. In the east, the Wehrmacht still pushed toward Moscow, but its advance had slowed. The soldiers were starving, frostbitten, weary. Yet far from the front, in the comfort of a lakeside villa near Berlin, another kind of battle was being prepared, not of guns and trenches, but of papers and pens. The villa stood on the shores of Lake Wannsee, a quiet expanse of frozen water fringed by pine trees. Once a place of leisure for the wealthy, it now belonged to the security police and SS. On the morning of the 20th of January, 1942, 15 men arrived there for a meeting. They came not in uniforms of war, but in tailored coats, carrying briefcases. Most were lawyers, bureaucrats, and administrators. Their names were not yet infamous: Heydrich, Eichmann, Müller, Lang, Stuckart. They represented the ministries of justice, the interior, the Eastern territories, and the Nazi Party itself. Together, they formed the face of modern bureaucracy, educated, efficient, and utterly without conscience. The purpose of the meeting was stated plainly on the invitation: final solution of the Jewish question. The phrase sounded administrative, almost abstract, but beneath its blandness lay the decision to annihilate an entire people. The men entered the villa's bright rooms, where a fire crackled in the hearth. Coffee and cognac were served on polished trays. The table was set with neat stacks of paper lists, maps, statistics. Outside, the Tevelda lake glittered with ice. Inside, the air was calm, businesslike. The minutes of the meeting would later describe it as friendly and relaxed. At the head of the table sat Reinhard Heydrich, tall, blonde, immaculate, a man whose cold intelligence had earned him the title the Butcher of Prague. He had come to assert SS control over all anti-Jewish measures throughout Europe. His subordinate, Adolf Eichmann, acted as secretary, taking notes that would become the sole surviving record of the event. Heydrich began with a summary. There were, he said, roughly 11 million Jews in Europe, from Ireland to the Urals. Their fate, he explained, must be handled in a uniform and comprehensive manner. He spoke calmly, as if discussing logistics rather than lives. Deportations had already begun from Germany, Austria, and the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, he reminded them. Jews were being sent to the east, to ghettos, to camps, to special treatment. But the system was messy, inefficient. It required coordination between ministries, transport bureaus, and military authorities. The purpose of this meeting was to tidy the process, to make mass murder run on time. Around the table, the men nodded. Some raised technical points. How should mixed-marriage Jews be classified? What about veterans of the Great War? Should exceptions be allowed for those in essential industries? Each question was answered with chilling precision. Mixed-blood individuals would be categorized by percentage half-Jew, quarter-Jew, with corresponding penalties. War veterans might be postponed from deportation for the time being. Skilled laborers would be used until no longer useful. Even mercy was scheduled. Heydrich then outlined the method. Jews fit for work would be transported east to labor camps, where a large portion will doubtlessly succumb through natural reduction. The remainder, those unfit for labor, will have to be dealt with accordingly. The words were chosen carefully. No one needed to ask what they meant. In bureaucratic language, dealt with accordingly meant death. As he spoke, Eichmann distributed copies of a document, a statistical table listing the Jewish population country by country. France, 865,000. The Netherlands, 160,800. Romania, 342,000. The Soviet Union, over 5 million. Each number was a community, a history, a universe of families. Yet on the paper, they were simply digits in neat columns. When Eichmann later testified at his trial, he said the meeting had been extraordinarily important because it confirmed that everyone present understood and agreed on the policy. There would be no confusion, only cooperation. Some of the officials, such as Dr. Wilhelm Stuckert from the Ministry of the Interior, offered suggestions to ensure legal consistency. Others discussed how to seize property left behind. The conversation drifted easily between the technical and the terrible. They debated sterilization programs, the age at which children should be separated from parents, and the order in which European countries would be cleansed. The tone remained polite. They laughed occasionally. Minutes later, they would toast with cognac. Outside, the lake lay silent under snow. A single crow circled above the trees. None of the men looked out the window. The meeting lasted just 90 minutes. When it ended, Heydrich thanked the participants for their cooperation. Copies of the minutes, the Wannsee Protocol, were typed and distributed in numbered sets, to be returned or destroyed after reading. One copy survived, discovered after the war by chance. It would later serve as one of the most damning documents in history. When the men left the villa, the sun was setting behind the frozen water. Their cars drove away in quiet procession, leaving only tire tracks in the snow. Within months, their decisions would translate into trains, timetables, and ashes. Elsewhere that same winter, Europe was already dying. In Chelmno, the first stationary extermination camp, gas vans hissed daily. their engines rumbling like distant thunder. Victims were told they were being deloused. In Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, construction crews worked under frost-bitten skies to build gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. Polish laborers were told they were building new housing for soldiers. They did not yet know they were constructing death. The men who designed these places were not demons but engineers. They measured airflow, temperature, capacity. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, blueprints showed where the Zyklon B pellets would fall from ceiling vents, how furnaces could operate continuously, how ashes could be crushed to dust. Murder had become a problem of architecture. The Reich's engineers solved it with precision. From the Wannsee Villa's paper trails flowed rivers of trains. Every transport required signatures, fuel allotments, guards, schedules. Each journey was planned down to the minute. The passengers were herded aboard with luggage, believing they were being resettled. At the stations, German officials stamped documents, filed receipts, checked headcounts. Bureaucracy gave atrocity a heartbeat of routine. And all the while, the war raged on. In the east, German troops fought for Stalingrad. In the west, bombs fell on London. But inside occupied Poland, the war was not about victory, it was about erasure. Entire Jewish communities that had survived centuries vanished in weeks. Towns like Tarnow, Piotrkow, Radom, Lublin, once alive with markets and synagogues, were emptied and silent. The ghettos were dissolved, their residents transported east. The word deportation became a euphemism for disappearance. In spring 1942, trains began arriving at the new death camps. At Belzec, victims were told to undress for showers. Guards shouted, dogs barked, whip cracks echoed. Within minutes, the doors were sealed, engines started, silence followed. Then the digging began, graves for thousands. The soil turned gray with ash. The next day, another train came. Back in Berlin, reports flowed in, written in the same sterile style as any business correspondence. Special treatment of 97,000 persons completed. Read one. Transport from Krakow district arrived without incident, said another. Each phrase was a grave. But to the men who had met at Wannsee, these documents represented progress. The efficiency of the system astonished even its creators. By the end of 1942, entire regions were declared Judenrein cleansed of Jews. Heydrich would not live to see it. He was assassinated by Czech resistance that summer. But his legacy survived in every schedule, every report, every handful of dust that once was human. His death changed nothing. The machine he helped design ran by itself. As months passed, the villa by the lake returned to silence. Birds nested in its eaves. The water thawed and glittered once more. Families picnicked nearby, unaware of what had been decided there. Only decades later would visitors walk its halls in whispers, reading the names of those 15 men and wondering how intelligence and civilization could coexist with such inhumanity. To understand Wannsee is to understand the true nature of evil. It was not chaos or madness. It was order, deliberate, polite, methodical. The genocide of 6 million Jews was not born in secret dungeons, but in sunlit offices, executed by men who said, "Please" and "Thank you." They saw themselves not as killers but as administrators. They left the blood to others. In the quiet hours of night, when the war's roar faded and the trains ceased to move, perhaps one or two of them felt the weight of what they had signed. Perhaps not. History records no remorse, only results. What began at Wannsee would ripple outward until there was scarcely a corner of Europe untouched. From Norway to Greece, from France to Alabadolers, the Soviet steppes, the same system unfolded: arrest, transport, selection, extinction. The conference by the lake had turned murder into paperwork. And once paperwork exists, a system can operate without conscience. Years later, when Allied troops liberated the camps, they would find the traces, the ledgers, the schedules, the signatures, the handwriting of educated men, still crisp in ink, beside mountains of bone. The documents matched the graves perfectly. Outside the villa today, the lake remains serene. In winter, it freezes again. In summer, it reflects the trees. Visitors stand on its shore, listening to the wind that brushes across the water. Somewhere beneath that calm surface lies an echo of the voices that once debated life and death over coffee. The echo is faint now, but it endures a reminder that the greatest horrors often begin in the quietest rooms. And so, the story of the final solution moved from decision to implementation, from paper to ash. The lake kept its beauty. The world kept its silence. Factories of death. The trains began to roll in the spring of 1942. They rattled through the heart of Europe from Paris and Vienna, from Prague, Amsterdam, Thessaloniki, and Warsaw, slow, steady, unstoppable. Each train carried thousands of people, packed into wooden freight cars meant for cattle. The doors were sealed from the outside. Inside, there was no light, no water, no air. Mothers held crying infants. Old men prayed. Children asked where they were going. The only answer was the rhythm of the wheels. To the east, to the east. At first, the travelers believed they were being resettled. They carried small suitcases labeled with their names and addresses, thinking they might someday retrieve them. But at the end of the line, there were no new homes, no villages, no welcome. There were only barbed wire fences, chimneys, and the smell of burning. The Nazis called them Vernichtungslager, extermination camps. To the world, they were places that officially did not exist. Their names would later become the vocabulary of horror. Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and above all, Auschwitz-Birkenau. These camps were not built to imprison. They were built to erase. Auschwitz began as a Polish army barracks. When the Germans occupied Poland, they turned it into a concentration camp for political prisoners. Over time, it grew. One camp became 3, each more lethal than the last. The new section, Birkenau, was designed specifically for mass extermination. Engineers drew the plans with precision. Parallel rail lines, unloading platforms, crematoria with tall chimneys. Each building had a purpose. Every pathway was calculated to move people efficiently from arrival to death. The design looked almost industrial, and that was the point. The SS wanted a system that required no thought, no feeling, just process. Victims were numbers on a form, units of cargo on a manifest. The killing had become a business, and business had to run smoothly. At the smaller camps, like Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, the method was simple. Trains arrived, doors opened, shouting began. Guards ordered people to leave their luggage on the platform for disinfection. Men were separated from women and children. Those too weak to walk were told they would receive special care. Everyone was ordered to undress. The air filled with confusion, then with fear. In minutes, they were herded down narrow passageways lined with barbed wire and camouflage branches. The path curved deliberately, so no one could see what waited ahead. At the end stood buildings marked with painted stars of David, pretending to be bathhouses. Inside, there were no showers, only darkness and gas. Engines started in adjoining rooms, and exhaust poured through pipes into sealed chambers. Within minutes, silence. Bodies were dragged out by other prisoners, Sonderkommandos, who worked under threat of death. Gold teeth were extracted. Hair was cut and packed into bags, labeled for shipment to factories. Every possession, every ounce of flesh, was repurposed. The camps turned murder into manufacture. In Treblinka, the efficiency was chilling. Trains arrived daily, sometimes 3 or 4 at a time. Each carried up to 2,000 people. Within 2 hours, all were dead, and the camp prepared for the next convoy. The commandant, Franz Stangl, later described the process as clean, orderly, and almost peaceful. He spoke as if he were describing a well-run factory, and in a way, he was. Between July 1000 1942, and October 1943. Nearly 900,000 Jews were murdered at Treblinka. Almost none survived to tell. At Sobibor, escape came in whispers. Prisoners, realizing their certain fate, organized an uprising in October 1943. They killed several guards and broke through the fences. Around 300 reached the forest. Only a handful survived the war. But for one day, the killing stopped. And for one moment, defiance breathed. Again. If Treblinka and Belzec were factories, Auschwitz-Birkenau was an entire industrial district. The camp sprawled across miles of marshland, surrounded by electric fences and guard towers. Trains entered directly through the gates, beneath the iron words, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. To those arriving, the phrase seemed to promise survival through labor. It was a lie carved in metal. Upon arrival, prisoners faced the selection. SS doctors stood beside the tracks, pointing left or right. One direction meant temporary life as a slave laborer. The other led straight to the gas. Women with children, the elderly, and the sick were almost always sent to the latter. The decisions took seconds, but determined eternity. Those chosen for labor were tattooed with numbers on their arms. Their names were erased, replaced by digits that would outlive them. They were issued striped uniforms, their heads shaved. Every trace of individuality was stripped away. They became part of the camp's rhythm roll calls at dawn. Endless work in the cold, hunger gnawing through each day. The average life expectancy of a laborer was a few months. Meanwhile, the killing proceeded without pause. The gas chambers at Birkenau could hold more than 2,000 people at once. Zyklon B pellets, originally a pesticide, were dropped through vents. Within 10 minutes, the chamber was silent. Ventilation fans cleared the air. Crematorium doors opened. Bodies were carried to furnaces or burned in open pits when the ovens overflowed. Ashes were scattered in ponds or used as fertilizer. Nothing was wasted. In one report, an SS officer wrote that the system is functioning perfectly. He meant it as praise. The Sonderkommandos, mostly young Jewish prisoners, performed the grimmest tasks. They knew they would be killed eventually to eliminate witnesses, yet some managed to record what they saw. Buried notes and photographs later uncovered tell their truth. Men working, in silence beside mountains of the dead, smoke dimming the sun, a world turned upside down. They wrote, not for rescue, they knew none would come, but for remembrance. If anyone ever finds this, one note read, let the world know what happened. Life in the camps was a distortion of life itself. Hunger ruled every hour. Prisoners slept in wooden bunks, stacked like shelves, sharing a single blanket among 3 or 4. The air reeked of disease and decay. Beatings were common, executions public. Yet, even here, moments of humanity flickered, a stolen crust of bread shared, a whispered prayer, a lullaby sung to calm a dying child. The smallest kindness became an act of rebellion. Guards, often teenagers indoctrinated by Nazi youth programs, carried out their duties with mechanical precision. Some laughed as they worked, others grew numb. The system required neither hatred nor joy, only obedience. Orders came from above, and the machinery continued. Beyond the fences, the war itself had begun to turn. In 1943 and 1944, German defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk signaled that the tide was shifting. Yet the SS intensified its killing, as if to erase as much evidence as possible before the inevitable collapse. Transports increased. Entire communities from Greece, Hungary, and France were liquidated. Even as bombs fell on German cities, trains to Auschwitz ran on time. In Hungary, the last great deportation began in the spring of 1944. Within just 8 weeks, over 400,000 Hungarian Jews were sent to Auschwitz. Most were murdered on arrival. The efficiency stunned even the camp's administrators. One railway official boasted that each train was scheduled with Swiss precision. The clockwork of genocide kept perfect time. The outside world was not entirely ignorant. Reports smuggled out of occupied Poland described the existence of death camps. In 1942, two escapees from the Polish underground, Jan Karski and Witold Pilecki, carried eyewitness accounts to Allied leaders. Their stories were so horrific that some refused to believe them. "Surely," one diplomat said, "civilization has not sunk to such depths." But it had. When British and American planes flew over Poland, they photographed Auschwitz without realizing what it was. The vast complex looked like any other industrial site. The chimneys were working, after all. By late 1944, the Red Army was advancing through the east. As they approached Poland, the SS began dismantling the camps. Records were burned, buildings destroyed, prisoners forced on death marches toward Germany. Those too weak to walk were shot. The roadsides of Europe filled with bodies. Yet even then, some guards continued to claim loyalty to duty. The machine could crumble, but its mentality persisted. Auschwitz was liberated on the 27th of January 1945. Soviet soldiers entered through the snow-covered gates and found a silence so deep it defied language. Piles of shoes, glasses, hair, and ash lay in heaps taller than men. Skeletons in striped uniforms stared blankly at their liberators, unable to understand that the war for them was over. More than 1 million people had perished there, 9 out of 10 of them Jews. The survivors would carry their ghosts for the rest of their lives. In the months that followed liberation, the truth emerged slowly. Journalists wrote of the camps. Photographers captured the remains. Yet even images could not convey the stench, the silence, the scale. People asked, how was this possible? The answer lay not only in ideology, but in structure, in trains, offices, budgets, and silence. The camps were not the opposite of civilization. They were its reflection twisted. The same skills that built cities had built crematoria. The same discipline that governed factories had organized extermination. Evil had not shouted. It had whispered through the sound of paper being stamped. The factories of death proved that genocide could be engineered with modern efficiency. It required no wild rage, only planning. The men who created it saw themselves as problem solvers, not murderers. They signed documents, held meetings, filed reports, and in their wake lay 6 million lives extinguished. Today, the ruins of those camps remain. At Birkenau, the rails still lead through the gate, vanishing into grass. The chimneys stand like gravestones against the sky. Visitors walk slowly, their footsteps muffled by snow or sand. The air feels heavy, as if still thick with memory. Birds sing, but softly, as though aware they are trespassing on sacred ground. No monument can contain the enormity of what happened there. The ashes of millions lie mixed with the soil, drifting with each wind. Yet the earth endures patient, silent, eternal. It remembers what men would rather forget. And as night falls over those empty fields, the same stars shine above that once looked down on the smoke. The world turns, seasons change, generations come, and exodi go, but the echo of those trains remains. It hums faintly in the rails, in the rusted fences, in the very air. A soundless reminder that civilization, left unguarded by conscience, can devour itself. The factories are gone, but the warning endures. Auschwitz, the empire of smoke. The air above Auschwitz was never still. Even on quiet mornings, when the frost glistened over the barbed wire and the sky was pale as ash, the wind carried the faint, bitter scent of burning. It was a smell that clung to everything, to uniforms, to the walls of barracks, to the very soil. For those who lived within the fences, it was the smell of death disguised as ordinary weather. Auschwitz was unlike any place on earth. It was not one camp, but many a network of cruelty woven into the heart of occupied Poland. It began as a prison, But by 1942, it had become something else entirely, a city of the condemned. There were barracks, workshops, hospitals that healed no one, factories built by slave hands. At its center stood the chimneys, tall and relentless, pouring gray smoke into the sky. The smoke never stopped. It was the pulse of the place, its heartbeat. Every day, trains arrived at the siding just beyond the main gate. Guards shouted orders in German. Dogs barked. Boots struck gravel. The doors opened, and people stepped down, dazed, blinking into the light. Some wore their Sabbath best, believing they were going to work. Others carried small suitcases or bundles tied with cloth. They had been told they were being resettled. Many still believed it. The SS officers smiled and spoke politely, pointing the way. It was deception perfected to an art. Selections took place quickly, almost rhythmically. A doctor stood beside the tracks, his white gloves bright against the soot. With a flick of the wrist, left or right, he decided who would live for a while and who would die that day. The young, the strong, the skilled were sent toward the barracks. The old, the sick, the children, the mothers with infants were sent toward the chimneys. They were told they were going to shower and receive new clothes. Some even thanked the guards for their kindness. The path to the gas chambers wound gently between birch trees, a cruel imitation of peace. The buildings looked ordinary, low concrete blocks, clean and quiet. Inside, the victims were told to undress, to hang their clothes neatly, and remember the peg number. They followed instructions because obedience had long been their only defense. Then the doors closed, and the illusion ended. Within minutes, silence replaced the world. For those chosen for labor, life continued, if it could be called life. The prisoners awoke before dawn, summoned by whistles and blows. Roll call lasted for hours in the freezing dark as guards counted and recounted the rows of bodies. If one man fainted, all were punished. The work that followed was endless: hauling stones, building roads, digging trenches. The goal was exhaustion, not production. Men collapsed where they stood. Women stumbled beneath loads too heavy to bear. Those who faltered were beaten or shot. The guards kept meticulous records. Every death was a number, every corpse a statistic. Hunger ruled everything. A bowl of watery soup became a treasure, a crust of bread, an act of grace. Prisoners traded buttons or scraps of paper for a sip of broth. At night, they lay side by side on wooden planks, pressed together for warmth, whispering names of loved ones long gone. In the darkness, they prayed not for freedom, but for another sunrise. Amid this despair, acts of humanity persisted. A prisoner might share his ration with another, knowing it could mean his own death. A woman might whisper lullabies to calm a frightened child, even as guards screamed nearby. In such moments, the camp's purpose to erase all traces of compassion was quietly defied. Survival itself became resistance. Beyond the barbed wire, factories loomed. The Nazis had made Auschwitz part of their industrial empire. German companies like IG Farben used the labor of prisoners to build chemical plants and manufacture synthetic fuel. The work was backbreaking, and the mortality rate unbearable, but the system was profitable. The SS treated human lives as renewable material, cheap, replaceable, anonymous. The collaboration between state and industry made the camp both a killing ground and a business venture. It was genocide turned into enterprise. Among the prisoners were people from nearly every corner of Europe: Poles, Hungarians, Dutch, French, Greeks, Italians. They spoke different languages, sang different songs, prayed in different ways, yet in suffering they became one. They shared the same hunger, the same fear, the same thin thread of hope. Their humanity, stripped of everything else, became the one thing the Nazis could not fully destroy. Some were musicians. The SS ordered them to form orchestras to play as the prisoners marched to work or to the gas chambers. The music was meant to maintain order, but it became something else, a fragile bridge between life and death. A violinist might bow trembling notes into the cold air, tears freezing on his face, the melody following those who would not return. Even the songs of despair carried beauty that the camp could not silence. In another corner of Auschwitz, scientists in white coats performed experiments. They called it research, but it was torture disguised as study. Victims were injected with diseases, frozen in ice water, mutilated without anesthesia. The most notorious of these men was Josef Mengele, the camp doctor whose obsession with twins turned children into subjects of cruelty. He walked the platforms during selections, calm and smiling, a clipboard in hand. His victims remembered his charm, the soft voice that hid the monster. For him, science was not a pursuit of knowledge, but a theater for control. Even within the logic of evil, his experiments stood apart in their perversity. Through 1943 and 1944, the camp grew ever larger. New barracks were built as old ones overflowed. The trains came faster, the chimneys burned higher. From the skies, Allied bombers flew missions nearby, but rarely targeted the camp. The world still struggled to comprehend what these places truly were. The scale defied belief. Even those who heard rumors found them too monstrous to accept. Civilization could not imagine its own reflection. Inside the fences, however, truth was unavoidable. Prisoners learned to read the sky. When the smoke turned darker, it meant transports from Hungary had arrived. When the wind blew from the west, the stench of burning flesh swept through the barracks. Life was measured in breaths between fear. And yet, even in that inferno, love flickered. Couples found each other across work details, holding hands for a moment behind a shed. A man might carve a name into a wooden wall, hoping it would outlast him. A woman might hide a scrap of paper, a prayer, beneath the floorboards. These were the small rebellions of the human soul. In the summer of 1944, the killing reached its peak. The deportation of Hungary's Jews flooded Auschwitz, with victims hundreds of thousands in a matter of weeks. The crematoria burned day and night, their flames visible for miles. When the furnaces overflowed, bodies were burned in open pits. The smoke was so thick that pilots flying overhead described it as a storm cloud anchored to the ground. The camp's doctors, clerks, and guards continued their routines, recording everything. Even annihilation had paperwork. But within that machine, something began to stir the whisper of revolt. Among the Sonderkommandos, who worked at the crematoria, rumors spread of a plan. They had smuggled small amounts of gunpowder from a munitions factory, gathered by women prisoners who risked everything to pass it on. On an October day in 1944, they struck. The crematorium was blown apart, several guards killed. The rebellion was crushed within hours, and nearly all who took part were executed. Yet in their defiance, they reclaimed the one thing the Nazis had tried to take entirely: their agency, their humanity. Even at the gates of death, they had chosen to act. By late 1944, the war was turning. The Red Army advanced from the east, and the SS began to erase evidence of their crimes. Files were burned, ashes scattered, witnesses shot. The prisoners sensed the change. Rumors of liberation spread like sparks, fragile but real. In January 1945, as Soviet troops drew near, the Germans evacuated the camp. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced to march through the snow toward other camps inside Germany. Many collapsed along the road, shot where they fell. Those who survived would later call it the Death March, a final cruelty for those who had already endured too much. When the Soviets entered Auschwitz on January 27, they found only a few thousand emaciated survivors. The soldiers moved through the barracks in silence, their boots crunching on frost and ash. They found mountains of belongings, suitcases, shoes, eyeglasses, children's toys, and more than 7 tons of human hair packed into sacks. The sight defied imagination. One soldier wrote later, "We thought we had seen war. We had not seen this." For the survivors, liberation was both blessing and burden. Freedom could not erase what had been seen, nor could it bring back those lost. They stood amid ruins of the camp, surrounded by ghosts. Some kissed the ground, others wept without sound. Many could not speak at all. The silence of Auschwitz lingered long after its walls had fallen. In the months that followed, journalists and photographers documented what remained. The world began to see the images, the skeletal faces, the piles of ash, the empty chimneys. Yet even then, comprehension lagged behind reality. No photograph could capture the stench, quiet, the sense that the air itself had memory. The name Auschwitz became shorthand for evil, but for those who had lived it, it was more than that. It was a place where humanity had been tested and found both guilty and enduring. Years later, survivors would describe how even within that nightmare, they felt the faint presence of life's stubbornness, a bird singing beyond the fence, a sunrise that painted the sky pink over the barracks, a hand reaching out in darkness. In those fragments, they found the strength to keep breathing. The Nazis had mastered the art of killing, but they had never learned how to extinguish hope completely. Today, the ruins of Auschwitz stand preserved. The wooden barracks lean under time, the tracks end in silence. Visitors walk slowly, their footsteps soft, their voices low. The wind moves through the watchtowers with a sound like whispering. In the museum halls lie the artifacts, the glasses, the suitcases, the hair, each an echo of a life. Once whole, the air feels heavy with remembrance. To stand there is to feel both the weight of history and the fragility of existence. The smoke has cleared, but its shadow remains, stretching across generations. The empire that once ruled through death has long since fallen, but its warning endures. It tells us that civilization, without compassion, can become a factory of despair, and that even in the darkest place, the human spirit can flicker, faint yet unyielding, like a candle that refuses to die. Auschwitz was built to destroy. Instead, it became eternal proof that destruction can never silence memory, collaboration, and silence. The Holocaust did not unfold in isolation. It spread like a shadow across a continent that looked away. For every camp and every ghetto, there were towns, villages, and cities nearby, places where trains passed, where smoke rose beyond the trees, where the air carried whispers of what was happening. The final solution was built not only on orders and soldiers, but on cooperation, apathy, and fear. It was made possible as much by silence as by ideology. When German troops swept across Europe, they found collaborators waiting in many of the lands they occupied. In France, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, and Norway, governments that had once spoken of liberty now learned to survive through obedience. Some saw collaboration as necessity, others as opportunity. Anti-Jewish laws appeared even before German pressure demanded them. Local police compiled lists, seized property, and helped fill the trains. Bureaucracy did not vanish under occupation, it simply changed masters. In France, the collaboration was perhaps the most refined. The government of Vichy, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, declared loyalty to German authority while claiming to defend French honor. It enacted its own racial statutes, excluding Jews from public service, education, and the arts. French officials assured the Nazis that they would take care of their own Jewish problem. On summer mornings, French police knocked on doors in Paris and Lyon, arresting families while their German overseers remained at a distance. In July 1942, during what became known as the Vel d'Hiv Roundup, more than 13,000 Jews, including 4,000 children, were herded into a Paris sports arena before deportation to Auschwitz. The Germans did not have to ask. The French police did it for them. In the Netherlands, a country known for its tolerance, nearly 3/4 of its Jewish population perished. Dutch civil registries, meticulously kept, made identification simple. Trains left from Amsterdam's Westerbork transit camp almost daily, carrying men, women, and children toward death. Some railway workers tried to look away. Others made sure the trains ran on time. Bureaucratic precision, once a mark of civic pride, became a tool of destruction. In Eastern Europe, collaboration took a harder, bloodier form. The German invasion of the 20.42 Soviet Union in 1941 unleashed chaos. Old hatreds, long suppressed, erupted into violence. In Lithuania, Latvia, and Ukraine, local militias formed spontaneously, attacking Jewish neighbors with horrifying enthusiasm. Pogroms swept through towns where families had lived side by side for generations. German officers observed with approval, noting how local elements are showing initiative. Entire communities were wiped out before the SS even arrived. The Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads, could not have operated so efficiently without help from these volunteers, who knew the streets, the language, the names. There were also the informers, the watchers at the window, the neighbors who pointed and whispered. Some were motivated by greed, a house, a business, a piece of furniture left behind. Others were driven by fear. Under occupation, silence could save one's life, and denunciation could earn a favor or protection. In such darkness, morality became a fragile thing, easily broken. Yet, there were exceptions. Quiet, luminous acts of defiance scattered across the map like faint stars in a clouded sky. In Denmark, the population refused to cooperate. When the Germans ordered the arrest of Danish Jews in October 1943, ordinary citizens acted with astonishing unity. Fishermen ferried nearly 7,000 people across the Öresund Strait to safety in neutral Sweden. It was one of the few times an entire nation stood between victims and their oppressors. The cost was immense risk, yet the Danes proved that decency could prevail even in darkness. In Bulgaria, too, courage stirred. When Nazi pressure mounted to deport the country's Jews, Orthodox bishops, parliamentarians, and ordinary citizens protested openly. The government hesitated, stalled, and ultimately refused. Bulgarian Jews survived not because the system protected them, but because people inside it found the strength to say no. Their defiance stood in contrast to so many who remained silent. Elsewhere, resistance was quieter, but still real. In occupied Poland, where death lurked on every corner, brave souls risked their lives to hide Jews. The Polish underground created the Żegota Council, dedicated solely to saving them. Catholic families concealed children in attics, monasteries, and cellars. Among these rescuers was a social worker named Irina Sendler, who smuggled over 2,000 Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto, placing them with Polish families and recording their real names on slips of paper buried in jars beneath an apple tree. Her actions were nearly suicidal, yet she never stopped. For her, saving even one child was worth dying for. Still, these acts were rare. For every life saved, thousands were lost. In the ghettos, rumors of help came and went like wind, but the trains kept rolling. In Warsaw, where 500,000 Jews were crammed into less than 2 square miles, hunger and disease killed more than bullets. When the Germans began liquidating the ghetto in 1943, its inhabitants rose in desperate revolt. They fought for weeks with homemade weapons, knowing they could not win, only die on their own terms. The ghetto burned, block by block, under the weight of tanks and flamethrowers. From the rubble rose black smoke, the same smoke that hung above the camps, and a defiant whisper, "We were here." In Western Europe, the illusion of ignorance persisted. Many citizens claimed they did not know what was happening to their Jewish neighbors, and perhaps, in part, they did not. The full scale was unimaginable. Yet the empty houses, the confiscated shops, the deportations conducted in daylight were impossible to miss. People simply adjusted, as people do, telling themselves that it was politics, not murder, that the trains were taking workers, not families. To survive, they chose not to see. Governments in exile protested. Churches issued statements, but few took real action. Pope Pius XII spoke in general terms about suffering, but avoided direct condemnation, fearing retribution and political consequences. The silence of the Vatican remains one of history's most debated questions. Some priests and nuns risked their lives to hide the persecuted, others turned them away. Morality, like faith, fractured under the weight of fear. Across the ocean, in the United States and Britain, the news of mass murder reached leaders by 1942. Reports from diplomats, resistance fighters, and Jewish organizations described the extermination program in detail, yet disbelief and hesitation prevailed. The war effort demanded focus. Military victory was deemed the only way to end the killings. Proposals to bomb the rail lines to Auschwitz were dismissed as impractical. In truth, the Allies could not imagine that precision bombing could undo what indifference had allowed to grow. Even as photographs and testimonies accumulated, the world's response remained limited to words. The silence was not always born of malice. For many, it was a silence of helplessness, of incomprehension. The mind recoils from the unimaginable. To accept that such cruelty could exist was to admit that humanity itself had failed. So people turned away, telling themselves that the rumors were exaggerated, that the world would return to order soon, but it never did. Not for the millions already gone. And yet, even within the machinery of occupation, humanity sometimes flickered where least expected. A German soldier might slip a starving prisoner a piece of bread. A railway clerk might delay a train by a few hours, giving one family a chance to escape. A neighbor might refuse to betray a friend, even knowing the penalty was death. These gestures, small and fragile, did not change history's course, but they gave it meaning. In a world ruled by silence, even a whisper of kindness was defiance. By 1944, collaboration had run its course. The war was turning, and with it came fear of accountability. Officials who once signed deportation orders now destroyed records. Police who had rounded up Jews claimed they had only followed orders. Towns that had ignored their neighbors began to speak of resistance. Memory was already being rewritten, even as the killing continued. The war's end would bring trials, but also amnesia, the convenient forgetting that allows nations to heal without fully confronting their own reflection. When the camps were liberated, the world discovered what collaboration and silence had truly enabled. Soldiers stumbled upon warehouses of shoes, mountains of hair, rooms filled with children's toys. They saw not only what the Nazis had done, but what millions of bystanders had allowed. In the stillness of those liberated camps, conscience itself stood accused. In the decades that followed, some collaborators were tried, others disappeared into anonymity. A few nations faced their guilt. Many preferred the comfort of myth, the myth of resistance, the myth of ignorance. But history has a way of remembering, even when people do not. The documents remained, the names remained, the numbers, the trains, the ashes, they could not be undone. And so, the story of collaboration is not merely about those who acted with hatred, but about those who did not act at all. It is about neighbors who closed their doors, governments that hesitated, and institutions that looked the other way. It is a story that stretches beyond borders and beyond time, asking each generation the same question. When faced with evil, what will we choose, silence or courage? The trains of the Holocaust no longer run, but their echoes move through history's corridors. They remind us that indifference is never neutral, that looking away is its own form of participation. The victims died not only because of what their killers believed, but because of what the world permitted. As the war neared its end and the Reich began to crumble, the silence of nations slowly gave way to the thunder of liberation. But the price of that awakening was unbearable. The ashes that drifted across Europe were not only the remains of millions, they were the remnants of conscience itself, burned and scattered to the wind. The Holocaust was a human crime, but collaboration and silence made it a continental one. The camps were the end of a road that began not in Berlin, but in every place where a door closed, where fear triumphed over compassion, where someone said, "It is not my concern," and that, perhaps, is the darkest truth of all, that evil did not act alone. It was welcomed by the quiet. The fall of the Reich and liberation. By the winter of 1944, the empire that had once stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga was collapsing upon itself. The roads of Europe were filled not with marching soldiers now, but with the broken remains of armies in retreat. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted barely 12. Yet even as defeat closed in, the machinery of murder kept moving, like a wheel that had forgotten how to stop. The Eastern Front burned first. Soviet artillery thundered across the Vistula, shaking the frozen ground. Villages that had endured 4 years of occupation watched the horizon light with fire. The Red Army, hardened by Stalingrad and Kursk, moved westward through the ashes. Behind them lay liberation and vengeance. In the towns and forests of Poland, rumors spread that the Germans were fleeing, that the camps might soon be free. But for the prisoners inside the fences, freedom still felt like a rumor told by the dying. The SS began to erase its own crimes. Files were burned, photographs destroyed, gas chambers dismantled brick by brick. Yet there was too much evidence, too many witnesses. The camps were full, the trains still coming. So the Nazis chose a final cruelty. They emptied the camps by foot. Tens of thousands of skeletal prisoners were forced onto the roads in the dead of winter, driven west at gunpoint. These were the death marches, columns of ghosts moving through snow and silence. The roads were lined with bodies. Those who stumbled were shot. Those who begged for water were beaten. Villagers stood in their doorways and watched. Some slipped food to the prisoners when the guards looked away. Others shut their eyes until the column had passed. For the marchers, time dissolved into a blur of pain and cold. Each step was survival. Each breath was defiance. They no longer dreamed of rescue, only of one more hour of life. When liberation finally came, it arrived quietly at first. On a January morning in 1945, Soviet troops reached the outskirts of Auschwitz. They expected to find another German stronghold. Instead, they found silence and smoke still rising from the chimneys. Inside the gates, they discovered 7,000 survivors, living skeletons wrapped in rags, too weak to stand. Around them lay piles of suitcases, spectacles, and human hair, a landscape of ash. The soldiers stopped in disbelief. They had seen war, but never this. One officer wrote in his diary, "We could not understand what we were looking at. It was not a camp, it was the end of the world." Word spread slowly through the ranks. Reporters were summoned. Photographers arrived. The world would soon see the pictures, the rail cars, the heaps of bones, the empty eyes. But no photograph could convey the smell, the sweet, terrible odor of decay, or the silence that followed every sound. Liberation was not triumph, it was revelation. Humanity looked into a mirror and saw what it had become. In the West, the American and British armies were crossing the Rhine. Each mile deeper into Germany brought new discoveries. They found camps with names like Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and Mauthausen. At first, even seasoned soldiers doubted what they saw. They had expected prisons. They found cemeteries with the living still inside. At Buchenwald, near the cultural city of Weimar, American troops walked past stacks of corpses reaching the height of walls. Survivors, barely recognizable as human, greeted them with hollow smiles. Some tried to sing. The liberators stood in silence, rifles hanging uselessly at their sides. General Eisenhower, when he arrived days later, ordered every journalist and camera crew to document the scene. "Let the world see," he said, "because someday someone will say, 'This never happened.'" His words were prophetic. At Dachau, the first and oldest of the concentration camps, American soldiers entered boxcars filled with hundreds of bodies left to rot in the spring sun. Rage overcame discipline. In that moment of horror, some soldiers turned their guns on the SS guards, shooting them where they stood. It was not justice. It was something raw, the instinctive rejection of evil when words no longer suffice. Afterward, the soldiers sat down and wept. Bergen-Belsen, liberated by the British, was a vision from the pit. The camp had become a dumping ground for prisoners evacuated from elsewhere. 60,000 people lay dying amid unburied corpses. Typhus swept through like fire. British medics and nurses worked until they collapsed, trying to feed, to clean, to bury. Bulldozers pushed heaps of bodies into mass graves because there was no other way. The soldiers forced captured SS men and women to do the same work, to confront the carnage they had helped create. Newsreel cameras recorded it all, and for the first time, civilians back home saw the cost of silence flickering on theater screens. For the survivors, liberation was both miracle and torment. The gates were open, but beyond them lay nothing familiar. No homes, no families, no certainty. Many were too weak to walk. Doctors tried to feed them, but even nourishment could kill those starved for years. Others died with smiles on their faces, their last words simple, "I am free." As the Allies advanced, they uncovered not isolated crimes but an entire system. Ledgers, blueprints, and orders revealed how meticulously death had been planned. Trains scheduled to the minute. Quotas of victims tallied like shipments. Even as Germany crumbled, administrators filed reports, requesting more fuel, more guards, more Zyklon B. Bureaucracy had continued to function while morality had ceased. In the cities, civilians claimed ignorance. "We did not know," they said, and perhaps they had not known every detail, but they had seen the smoke, smelled the burning, watched the trains pass by. When Allied officers marched them through the camps to witness the evidence, many fainted, others wept, some turned away, whispering prayers. Confrontation with truth became its own punishment. Meanwhile, in the ruins of Berlin, the Reich met its end. Bombs fell day and night, reducing boulevards to rubble. In his bunker beneath the Chancellery, Adolf Hitler raged at imaginary armies, refusing surrender. His empire of death had devoured itself. On April 30th, 1945, he took his own life. Around him, the city burned. The walls shook, and silence settled like dust. By early May, the guns of Europe fell quiet. The war was over, but the suffering it had unleashed was only beginning to be understood. For the soldiers who had seen the camps, victory no longer felt like glory. Many wrote home of nightmares that would not fade. They spoke of faces staring from photographs, of children's shoes piled like mountains. Chaplains tried to find words, but language faltered. The human mind, they learned, can win wars and still lose innocence. In the weeks after liberation, Allied authorities faced an overwhelming task. Hundreds of thousands of survivors wandered the wreckage of Germany and Poland, stateless, homeless, searching for names on lists. Displaced persons camps were established to give them shelter. Doctors treated the sick. Soldiers shared rations. But healing was slow. Liberation did not erase hunger or grief. Some survivors walked back to their villages, only to find strangers living in their houses. Others discovered that their entire families were gone. They stood in empty streets, surrounded by familiar walls that no longer belonged to them. Justice, too, seemed impossible at first. The scale of the crime was beyond precedent. How do you measure guilt when an entire nation's machinery has been part of murder? Yet the victors resolved that there must be reckoning. In the ruins of Nuremberg, once the stage of Nazi rallies, a courtroom was built. The same microphones that had once carried propaganda now carried testimony. The world would hear the evidence, and the world would remember. Even as the trials began, life struggled to return. In the DP camps, survivors married, children were born, songs were sung again in Yiddish and Polish and Hebrew. Amid ruins, candles were lit for the dead, and prayers rose into the night. It was fragile, but it was life. From the ashes of annihilation, people began to rebuild. The liberators, too, carried their own memories home. In towns across America and Britain, veterans spoke hesitantly about what they had seen. Some were met with disbelief, surely. They were exaggerating. Others chose silence, unable to relive it. But the photographs they brought back told the story for them. They showed a world where humanity had been dismantled piece by piece, and then revealed again through compassion. As Europe buried its dead, the enormity of the Holocaust began to settle into the collective soul. Museums would come later, memorials much later still. In 1945, there were only ruins and questions. How had this happened? Why had no one stopped it sooner? And what did it mean for the idea of civilization itself? The answers were slow, painful, incomplete, but one truth stood clear. The smoke over Auschwitz had risen from the heart of Europe, not its edges. For years afterward, survivors would describe the moment of liberation not as joy, but as disbelief. Some said it was like waking from a nightmare, only to find the world still dark. Others remembered the sound of soldiers weeping, the warmth of soup, the first taste of clean water. Freedom, they said, was quiet, too quiet. After so much screaming, silence felt strange. In that silence lay the beginning of remembrance. The war had ended, but the moral reckoning had just begun. The Allied soldiers who had opened the gates, the journalists who had recorded what they saw, the survivors who had found their voices, all became the first witnesses. Their stories would ripple outward across decades, teaching the world that the line between civilization and barbarism is thinner than anyone wishes to believe. The fall of the Reich was not merely a military collapse. It was the collapse of illusion, the myth of progress, of obedience, of superiority. Out of its ruins rose the first fragile vows of a new world, that there would be laws against genocide, that nations would unite to prevent another. The promise was noble, though history would test it again and again. Yet in 1945, as spring came to a scarred continent, there was a kind of stillness, a breath between destruction and renewal. Fields once black with smoke began to green again. Children played in the rubble. Survivors walked toward the sunrise, thin but unbroken. The chimneys were cold now, the trains silent. The air smelled of earth, not ash. And so, among the ruins, humanity began its slow return. The war that had consumed the world was over, but its echo, the echo of boots, of weeping, of the quiet that follows unimaginable horror, would never truly fade. It lingers still, carried on the wind across those fields where the grass grows over bones, reminding us that liberation is not an ending. It is the beginning of memory, judgment, and reckoning. When the guns finally fell silent, Europe was a graveyard. Cities smoldered in ruin, fields were littered with bones, and the air itself seemed to mourn. But amid the ashes, one demand rose above all others: justice. For the first time in human history, the victors of war resolved not to avenge, but to judge. It would be a reckoning not only for armies, but for a whole system of evil that had disguised itself as law. The idea was born in the summer of 1945, when representatives of the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union gathered in London. Their purpose was to establish a tribunal to try Nazi leaders for crimes so vast that language itself faltered. They called it the International Military Tribunal and chose as its site the city of Nuremberg, once the proud stage of Hitler's rallies, now a shell of bombed stone. The symbolism was deliberate. The same hall that had echoed with chants of Sieg Heil would now echo with the verdict of mankind. The proceedings began on a cold November morning. 22 of the highest surviving Nazi officials sat in the dock. Behind them, translators whispered into headsets. Before them, the eyes of the world watched. Among The accused were names once spoken with fear: Hermann Göring, Hitler's chosen heir; Rudolf Hess, his deputy; Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister; and Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of the armed forces. Others were bureaucrats, economists, and propagandists, the architects of genocide dressed now in suits instead of uniforms. The charges were revolutionary: crimes against peace, war crimes, and above all, crimes against humanity, a phrase the world had never codified before. It meant murder and enslavement on a scale so deliberate, so systematic, that it transcended national boundaries. The law itself had to evolve to comprehend the crime. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense and strangely quiet. The defendants appeared composed, some even arrogant. Göring puffed his chest, smiling for cameras. Others stared into space, lost in denial or calculation. But when the prosecution began to present its evidence, silence replaced pretense. The first witnesses were survivors. Their voices were soft, their words unadorned. They spoke of ghettos and trains, of children torn from their mothers, of camps where smoke never ceased. They spoke of hunger so deep it hollowed the soul, and of hope that flickered only to be extinguished. Many wept as they spoke. The court, hardened by war, wept with them. Then came the documents, thousands of them. The Nazis had recorded their crimes with obsessive precision. Train schedules, minutes of meetings, invoices for Zyklon B, architectural plans of gas chambers. Each paper bore a signature, a date, an official seal. The bureaucracy of death exposed itself in black ink. The prosecutors turned these papers into testimony evidence not of chaos, but of order. The killings were not accidents of war. They were the purpose of it. Film reels followed. Allied cameramen had documented the liberation of the camps, and now those images filled the courtroom. The lights dimmed. On the screen appeared the emaciated faces of survivors, the mounds of corpses, the open furnaces. The defendants watched, some impassive, others visibly shaken. One turned away, another wept quietly. Göring muttered under his breath that the footage was propaganda, but no one listened. The silence that filled the chamber was heavier than any argument. For months, the world listened. Journalists from dozens of countries filled the galleries, their reports carried by radio to millions. For many, it was the first time they heard the full story: the planned extermination of 6 million Jews, the murder of millions more Poles, Russians, Roma, and others. The magnitude defied comprehension. The Holocaust, once a whisper of rumor, became undeniable truth. The defense, when it came, was thin. Most claimed ignorance or obedience. "I was only following orders," they said, a phrase that would echo for generations. They argued that the state, not the individual, bore responsibility. But the judges rejected this. They declared that morality cannot be erased by command, that conscience cannot be surrendered to hierarchy. "The essence of civilization," wrote the tribunal, "is that the individual has duties which transcend the dictates of the state." In that statement, humanity drew a new line. It meant that no one, not even generals or ministers, could hide behind flags or uniforms. The law of nations had been rewritten by the blood of millions. As testimony continued, the true machinery of the final solution unfolded in meticulous detail. Commanders described their orders. Bureaucrats described their ledgers. The names of camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Chelmno, Majdanek, became words of infamy. Maps were shown, tracing the veins of a continent, pulsing with trains to death. The tribunal did not seek revenge. It sought to make the record eternal. Among the witnesses was Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz. Calmly, he explained how he had organized the deaths of over a million people. His tone was bureaucratic, detached. "It was a difficult task," he said, "but necessary." When asked if he felt remorse, He answered that he had been following orders. The court fell silent again. No words could bridge the distance between what he said and what he had done. Outside the courtroom, the world wrestled with its own conscience. Nations that had turned away refugees or remained silent during the genocide now listened uneasily. The Holocaust was no longer a tragedy of others. It was a mirror for all. The myth of ignorance began to crumble. The verdicts were delivered in October 1946. 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death, including Göring, Ribbentrop, and Keitel. Göring cheated the hangman by swallowing poison in his cell the night before his execution. Others were hanged at dawn, their bodies cremated, their ashes scattered in a river so no monument could remain. 7 received prison terms, and 3 were acquitted, though history would not absolve them. Justice had been done, imperfect but real. Yet Nuremberg was more than punishment. It was a statement, a blueprint for the future. From it emerged the legal principles that would define international law. The idea that genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity are punishable wherever they occur, that just following orders is not a defense, and that truth, once spoken, must be preserved. In the years that followed, more trials took place. Doctors who had conducted experiments on prisoners faced judgment in what became known as the doctor's trial. Their experiments freezing, sterilization, chemical torture were described in chilling detail. Many were executed, and from their crimes arose the Nuremberg Code, the first global declaration of medical ethics, that no experiment may be done without consent, that human life must never again be treated as material. Industrialists too were tried. Executives from IG, Farben, Krupp, and Siemens were accused of profiting from slave labor. Their factories had thrived beside the camps, their profits fed by suffering. Some received prison sentences, others escaped with fines. The trials exposed a truth as uncomfortable as it was essential, that genocide had not been committed by soldiers alone, but enabled by businessmen, bankers, and clerks. Civilization itself had been complicit. In 1948, another court, the conscience of the world, gave words to what Nuremberg had revealed. The United Nations adopted the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, defining it as the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a people. The same year, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed, affirming that every human being possesses dignity that no state may take away. Out of the ashes of Auschwitz, the modern concept of human rights was born. Still, justice was incomplete. Thousands of perpetrators vanished into the chaos of post-war Europe, hiding under false names or blending back into society. Some fled to South America, others became useful to new powers in the Cold War. Many victims never saw their tormentors punished. Yet, the idea of accountability had taken root. The world had seen the abyss and refused to look away again. In the years to come, more trials would follow in Jerusalem, when Adolf Eichmann was captured and brought to face judgment. In The Hague, for crimes in Rwanda and the Balkans. Each of them traced its moral lineage to Nuremberg. The principle was simple yet profound. There are crimes so grave that they belong not to nations, but to humanity itself. For the survivors who testified, the trials were not closure. Nothing could restore what had been taken, but to speak was to reclaim power. Their words became the foundation of memory. They transformed their suffering into testimony, ensuring that the truth would outlive them. "I speak for the dead," one survivor said. "They have no voice, so I must use mine." Nuremberg also transformed how the world saw evil. It was no longer the work of monsters alone, but of men intelligent, cultured, capable of reason. It taught that civilization itself can become a weapon when morality sleeps. The trial did not only judge the Nazis, it judged the modern world and found it vulnerable. When the court adjourned for the last time, the judges left behind more than verdicts. They left a warning, They wrote that the law must stand above power, that truth must be preserved not for the victors, but for the generations yet unborn. In that solemn hall of Nuremberg, amid the ruins of empire, humanity took its first step toward moral reconstruction. Today, the courtroom still stands quiet, preserved, a museum of justice and memory. The wooden benches remain. The translation booths still line the walls. Visitors walk slowly among the displays, the photographs, the documents, the headlines. Outside, the city has been rebuilt. Its streets once, again filled with laughter and light. But within that chamber, time lingers. The echoes of those proceedings remain, a whisper that asks the same question the world continues to face. When evil rises again, will we remember what we learned here? Nuremberg was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of accountability, fragile, imperfect, but vital. It proved that even after the darkest descent, humanity can still search for law, for truth, for redemption. The gallows that once stood there are gone, but their shadow stretches still a reminder that memory is itself a form of justice, and that forgetting is the first step toward repetition. In the stillness of that courtroom, where judgment once fell like thunder, one can almost hear the faint murmur of those who testified, the echo of a world trying to speak truth after years of silence. Their words, their courage, their endurance, these are the true verdicts of history. For in their voices, humanity judged itself and chose, however painfully, to begin again. The survivors and the scars. When the camps were opened and the guns fell silent, the survivors emerged not as victors, but as remnants. They stepped out of the shadows, blinking against sunlight that felt unreal. The war had ended, yet for them, the world was still a grave. Behind the barbed wire, they had clung to the hope of life. Beyond it, they found only emptiness. They were scattered across a ruined continent, men and women who had lost everything but their breath. Their families were gone, their homes occupied, their towns erased. The trains that once carried them to death now carried them nowhere, and Europe itself felt like a vast cemetery. For many, liberation brought confusion more than relief. They wandered from camp to camp, searching for names on lists, for faces in crowds, for a familiar voice that might answer back. The Allied forces, overwhelmed by the human tide, established displaced persons camps, makeshift towns within the ruins. Barracks were converted into dormitories, hospitals into shelters. There, among strangers, survivors began the fragile task of rebuilding what the war had destroyed. They shared food, stories, and silence. They spoke in many languages: Polish, Yiddish, German, Hungarian, Russian, but grief needed no translation. At first, the camps were places of waiting for news, for relatives, for papers that might allow passage to another land. The future was uncertain, the past unbearable. And yet, even in those crowded rooms, life stirred. Schools were organized. Newspapers printed in Yiddish and Hebrew circulated between bunk beds. Weddings took place. Babies were born children of survivors, proof that death had not won entirely. It was life growing out of ashes, fragile but defiant. Religious services were revived. Candles flickered in remembrance for the 6 million gone. On holidays, voices rose in prayer. Voices that had once whispered in hiding now sang openly again. The sound was trembling, almost fearful, but it was real. Each word was both mourning and miracle. In these camps, faith and disbelief walked side by side, one questioning, one clinging, both searching for meaning. Survivors also organized committees, lobbying for their rights, for immigration, for recognition. Many dreamed of leaving Europe altogether. To them, the continent was a haunted place. Every road led to a memory, every village to betrayal. Some longed for Palestine, where rumors spoke of a homeland being reborn. Others dreamed of America, Canada, or Australia, distant lands where the shadows might finally recede. The roads to these places were uncertain, tangled in politics and quotas. But hope, once lost, was rediscovered in those dreams. Yet, even as they began to build new lives, survivors carried the weight of invisible wounds. Liberation had freed their bodies, not their minds. They were haunted by nightmares that returned each night: smell of smoke, the roll call, the faces that disappeared. The mind could not unsee what it had seen. The term post-traumatic stress disorder did not yet exist, but its presence filled every silence. Some woke screaming in the dark. Others fell into a silence so deep that words seemed impossible. There was also the question that gnawed at the heart of every survivor. Why me? Why had they lived when so many had perished? It was not gratitude they felt, but guilt. They replayed every moment in their minds: the friend who stumbled beside them, the mother who pushed them forward at the train platform, the stranger who gave them a crust of bread. Survival, they realized, was not a reward. It was a burden. They had to justify it somehow, by remembering, by telling, by living. But telling was not easy. When they spoke, few wanted to listen. The world, eager to rebuild, was tired of sorrow. Many survivors discovered that their stories made others uncomfortable, too dark, too unbelievable, too near. Some were met with pity, others with disbelief. "You must be exaggerating," people said. "It couldn't have been that bad." So the survivors learned to be silent. Silence became a form of self-protection, a way to keep the ghosts contained. Others, however, could not remain silent. They wrote, they testified, they taught. They gave names to the nameless, faces to the lost. Their words became bridges between the living and the dead. In courts, classrooms, and synagogues, they bore witness, turning pain into memory. They understood that to speak was not only to remember, it was to resist the erasure their enemies had intended. Among them were voices that would echo through history: Primo Levi, who transformed survival into literature; Elie Wiesel, whose haunting prose carried the weight of Auschwitz into the conscience of the world. Their words did not seek revenge, only understanding. They reminded the world that memory is not a monument, it is a responsibility. For the children and orphans of the Holocaust, the future was even more uncertain. Thousands had survived by hiding in convents or being raised under false names. When the war ended, they emerged as strangers to their own identities. Some refused to believe they were Jewish. Others searched desperately for families that no longer existed. Aid organizations tried to reunite them with surviving relatives, but often there were none to be found. In orphanages, they learned new names, new languages, new ways of belonging. Their eyes carried an old sadness, a wisdom that childhood should never know. Among those who cared for them were figures like Henrietta Sold and groups like the Jewish Agency, which arranged transports to Palestine. Ships filled with orphaned children set sail across the Mediterranean, carrying not only youth, but the hope of a people reborn. In those small faces, the world saw both the horror of what had been lost and the miracle of what had survived. In 1948, that hope took form. The State of Israel was established, a homeland born from the ashes of exile and extermination. Many survivors made their way there, some illegally, slipping past British patrols on rickety boats. They arrived thin, scarred, often barefoot, but carrying determination stronger than steel. They fought in the War of Independence that followed, defending the fragile new nation as though it were the last promise of history. For them, the creation of Israel was not only political, it was spiritual, an act of resurrection. Those who went elsewhere built new worlds too. In New York and Chicago, in Buenos Aires and Melbourne, in Paris and Montreal, survivors opened bakeries, tailor shops, and bookstores. They rebuilt synagogues, schools, and cultural centers. Slowly, Jewish life, nearly extinguished, began to thrive again. Every child born in these families was a victory over annihilation, a defiance whispered across generations. Still, the scars endured. For many, sleep was haunted by the past. A sound, a smell, could pull them back to the camps. Some could not bear to speak of it, not even to their children. In countless families, the Holocaust became a silence that hung over dinner tables, an unspoken inheritance passed down with every story untold. The second generation grew up surrounded by love tinged with grief, by laughter shadowed by absence. They learned to read their parents' pain not in words, but in pauses. Others, however, chose to tell everything. They brought their children to memorials, to classrooms, to synagogues, and said, "This is who we are. This is what was done to us." Out of trauma came identity. Out of loss, a fierce will to remember. The survivors taught the world that memory itself is sacred, that to forget is to repeat. Time, as it always does, moved on. The survivors aged. Their hair turned silver, their voices softer. Some returned to the sites of their suffering, standing before the gisses, gates of Auschwitz or Treblinka, in silence. They came not for closure, but to bear witness one last time. In their presence, the past felt near again. The wind carried echoes of songs once sung in defiance, prayers whispered in darkness. Psychologists later studied the effects of their trauma, giving names to what the survivors had endured: survivor's guilt, chronic grief, intergenerational memory. But these were clinical terms for something larger: the human heart's attempt to live after it has been broken. For survivors, healing was not forgetting, it was remembering without drowning. The legacy of these men and women cannot be measured in monuments alone. It lives in the classrooms where they spoke, in the books they wrote, in the children they raised, and in the countless lives they touched. They turned survival into testimony, sorrow into teaching. They refused to let the world move on without understanding what it had done. Even now, as the last survivors grow old, their presence remains a moral compass. When they speak, the room falls silent, not from politeness, but from awe. They carry within them the entire weight of a century's suffering and endurance. Each wrinkle, each tremor of voice, is a chapter of history. When they are gone, the task of remembrance will fall to us, to those who never saw the camps, but who can still hear the echoes. To listen to a survivor is to hear more than words. It is to glimpse the resilience of the human spirit, to feel the fragile thread that binds hope to despair. They remind us that civilization is not guaranteed, that kindness is not weakness, and that memory is the truest form of justice. Out of the Holocaust came not only grief, but a rebirth of conscience. Survivors became teachers, writers, builders, guardians of truth. Their lives are proof that even after the darkest night, the soul can still find morning, and in that light, they built the world anew. One family, one classroom, one memory at a time. For the survivors, the scars never vanished. They simply became part of living reminders etched into their very being that love, though wounded, can endure. And in enduring, it redeems. Legacy and lessons. The war ended long ago, but its echoes never stopped. Even now, decades later, the Holocaust remains more than an event. It is a question that history continues to ask of us all. The survivors grow fewer each year, their voices softer, their memories more precious. Yet what they witnessed continues to speak, whispering through books and classrooms, through museums and memorials, through the quiet prayers of those who still remember. The final solution did not merely destroy millions of lives. It shattered the illusion that civilization alone could protect us from barbarity. The same Europe that had given the world its art, its science, its philosophy, had also built the machinery of genocide. Trains ran on schedule, doctors filled out reports, clerks stamped papers. Everything was legal, efficient, modern. The lesson, carved in ash and bone, is that progress without conscience is only a more polished form of cruelty. After the war, the world tried to understand how it had happened. The Nuremberg trials offered one kind of answer, that law must speak when humanity fails. But the deeper truth could not be judged in court. It lived in the hearts of the bystanders, the collaborators, the indifferent. The final solution had thrived not only on hatred, but on silence. Ordinary people, teachers, neighbors, merchants had turned away, believing that indifference was innocence. In their quiet, evil found its audience. So remembrance became more than mourning. It became resistance. To remember is to refuse silence, to reject the comfort of forgetting. Every memorial, every candle, every story told by a trembling voice is an act of defiance against erasure. For the Nazis sought not only to destroy a people, but to erase their memory, to make the world forget they ever existed. Every remembrance defeats that goal. Every whispered prayer, every name recited, every museum built in their honor is a small victory over oblivion. In the years after the war, remembrance took many forms. In Jerusalem, on a hill overlooking the city, Yad Vashem was built a sanctuary of memory, where the names of millions are inscribed, each letter carved like a heartbeat preserved. In Washington, D.C., the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum rose to remind visitors that freedom is fragile and must be defended. Across Europe, stones were placed in pavements, each marked with the name of a victim, Stolperstein, stumbling stones, so that no one could walk through their city without being reminded of who once lived there. In classrooms across the world, teachers began to tell the story. Survivors visited schools, standing before rows of young faces that could not imagine the world they described. They showed the faded tattoos on their arms, spoke of the friends who did not return, and urged their listeners to guard against hatred wherever it hides. "You are the witnesses now," they would say, passing the torch of memory forward. Some students cried, others sat in stunned silence, but none left unchanged. As the decades passed, the world began to understand that memory must evolve. Technology became a new guardian of truth. Testimonies were filmed and digitized. Museums built interactive archives where voices could answer questions even after their owners were gone. In holographic theaters, children of the future could sit before a projection of a survivor and ask, "What happened to your family?" and hear an answer drawn from hours of recorded truth. Memory became immortal through light and sound, so that even when the last witness passes, their story will not. Yet memory has its enemies still. Almost as soon as the war ended, there were those who denied it. They called the gas chambers a lie, the numbers exaggerated, the witnesses unreliable. They wrapped hatred in the disguise of skepticism, spreading poison in books, speeches, and now on the internet. Holocaust denial is not ignorance. It is continuation, the same hatred reborn in whispers instead of shouts. It seeks to kill truth itself, to finish the work that bullets began. But against denial stands an army of memory historians, educators, survivors, and ordinary people who refuse to forget. Archives hold millions of documents. Photographs rest in museums, each one a piece of evidence that silence cannot erase. Nations have passed laws recognizing denial as a form of hate speech, a moral crime against history. And every time a survivor's story is told, denial loses ground. Every time a teacher lights a candle in a classroom, the darkness retreats a little further. The legacy of the Holocaust also reshaped the law of nations. From its ashes rose the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, both written in 1948. These documents declared that no government may destroy its own people, that human dignity transcends borders, and that the world has a duty to intervene when cruelty becomes law. It was an attempt to turn grief into principle, to make "never again" more than a slogan. Yet the decades that followed would show how fragile those vows could be. Genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur proved that remembrance alone cannot prevent repetition. The lesson of the Holocaust is not that evil can be ended, but that it must be recognized early, before the smoke rises, before the trains run. For the Jewish people, the Holocaust became both a scar and a foundation. It shaped the identity of Israel, the urgency of its creation, and the strength of its survival. In the diaspora, it infused Jewish life with both sorrow and pride, a determination to rebuild, to educate, to live as testimony. Each synagogue restored, each book republished, each family rebuilt was a silent vow. You did not succeed, but the legacy of the final solution does not belong to Jews alone. It belongs to all humanity. It asks every nation, every generation, to look within and ask, what would I have done? What silence am I keeping today? The Holocaust teaches that tyranny begins not with camps, but with words, with the casual cruelty that divides us from them, the propaganda that makes neighbors into strangers. Its warning is not confined to one time or people. It is a mirror, reflecting both the heights and the depths of what we are capable of. In art and culture, the Holocaust became an enduring theme. Writers and filmmakers grappled with how to represent the unrepresentable. Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel, Anne Frank. Their words gave faces to statistics, turning 6 million into individual souls. Films like Night and Fog and Schindler's List carried the story to new generations, ensuring that empathy would not fade with time. Each attempt to tell the story is imperfect, for language itself fails before such suffering, but silence would fail even more. For survivors and their descendants, remembrance is also a form of healing. Families gather each year for Yom HaShoah, the Day of Remembrance, lighting candles for those who never had graves. In the soft glow of those flames, history becomes personal again. Names are read aloud, grandparents, cousins, children restoring individuality to lives that the Nazis tried to reduce to numbers. Each name spoken aloud is a small resurrection. The Holocaust also left a question that humanity still struggles to answer. How could ordinary people do this? It is tempting to imagine the perpetrators as monsters, alien to our kind, but they were not. They were neighbors, clerks, soldiers, men who loved their families, who listened to music and read poetry, and still murdered without hesitation. The true horror of the Holocaust lies not only in its scale, but in its normalcy. It showed that evil does not need fire or fury. It only needs obedience. And so its lesson remains urgent, that conscience must never surrender to convenience, and that the smallest act of courage can be a wall against the tide. Education has become the most powerful tool of remembrance. Across the world, students learn the history of the Holocaust not merely to memorize dates, but to recognize patterns, the warning signs that precede every genocide, propaganda, scapegoating, the erosion of truth. Teachers remind them that hatred rarely begins with violence. It begins with jokes, with slurs, with silence. To study the Holocaust is to study ourselves, to understand how fear can twist the ordinary into the unthinkable. Now, as the last survivors pass away, their absence becomes another test. We can no longer rely on their voices. We must become their echo. The duty of memory falls to us, to keep telling the story even when it grows old, to defend truth when lies are easier. Remembering is not a burden, it is a blessing, a way to honor those who can no longer speak. And so, each generation must learn again. The Holocaust is not just history. It is a warning, written in smoke and silence. It tells us that prejudice, once tolerated, becomes law. That law, once corrupted, becomes death. It reminds us that human cruelty has no limit, but neither does human resilience. Every survivor, every rescuer, every voice of truth stands as proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, compassion survived. As night falls on this story, imagine the faces of those who endured, the mothers who sang lullabies in the ghettos, the fathers who whispered prayers in the barracks, the children who clutched each other as the trains moved through the night. Their lives ended in fire, but their voices did not. They live in memory, in museums, in books, in songs, and in the quiet determination of those who refuse to forget. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of all. Not vengeance, not despair, but remembrance. For as long as their names are spoken, the victims of the final solution have not vanished. As long as the world continues to teach, to tell, to listen, their light endures faint, flickering, but eternal. History is fragile, but memory is a promise that we will not look away again, that we will see the signs before they become flames, that the words "never again" will be more than an echo, they will be a choice, renewed each day by all who remember. Close your eyes now. The voices of the past fade into silence, not erased, but resting. The night is quiet again. Somewhere, far from the camps and the cities, the wind moves gently through the trees. And if you listen closely, beneath the rustle of leaves, you might still hear it, the soft murmur of those who endured, whispering across time. Remember us, tell our story, keep the world awake. Before you drift to sleep, if this story moved you, if you believe that remembering the past keeps our humanity alive, then I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to Lullaby of Empires, where history whispers through the night stories of courage, tragedy, and endurance, told softly for the heart that still listens. Your support helps these voices of the past live on. Until next time, rest well, and remember, even in silence, history speaks.